Hello everyone, Santia here, and welcome to my Dark Souls Trilogy Comparative Retrospective, by which I mean I'm going to look at all three Dark Souls games in, the trilogy, that's why they call it a trilogy, I guess, and kind of compare them between each other and look at how the design changed over time. That's one of the things that was really interesting to me, so to back up a little bit, several years ago, I did a retrospective on Dark Souls 2, and I was specifically looking at that game under the lens of how did it being called Dark Souls 2 affect how people perceived it and received it? And then it didn't really do anything until YouTube started showing it to people, and that brought along comments of like, oh, you should do one of these for Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3. I was like, that's an interesting idea, but why? Like, what is my premise? How am I going to go about doing that? And so with Dark Souls 2, I had this in of, what if this game hadn't been called Dark Souls 2? There's a lot of really cool stuff that this game does, but because expectations were set based upon the name and the fact that it didn't follow that closely with Dark Souls 1 in many regards, led to comparisons that perhaps made it fall short in a lot of people's eyes. So that got me thinking, what am I going to say about Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3? And so this idea of forging a legacy and then seeing where that legacy has gone really kind of stuck with me. So that's a little bit of the framework that I'm going to be using here as I go over this. Now, I do want to note specifically that I'm looking at my notes here. I originally wanted to do this with some like polish and gameplay footage and things like that, but I've decided not to for a couple of reasons. One, I want to actually get this done sometime. And specifically, I want to get this done sometime before Elden Ring comes out, which at the time of recording is extremely imminent, just a few days away. And I kind of want to get in before that, so that way I don't have a bunch of Elden Ring mechanics floating around in my head as well, because there's a lot of stuff to keep straight. So I will be going over my notes here and expanding on them. Unfortunately, I cannot scale up my cursor, but hopefully the notes are fine. I also have the Dark Souls wikis up if I need to look something up. So we're just going to have that going along. So yeah, a lot of this framework is going to be looking at, okay, what sort of reputation did Dark Souls 1 have, and how did things change as the series went along? Of course, Demon Souls came prior, but that was much more initially niche. And Dark Souls 1 is really kind of what put things on the stage, and that changed things a lot. So we have here my categories to include. This is why I kind of scroll back into here. So a lot of this is going to be very opinion-based. I'm going to be discussing a lot of facts, and I'm going to try to get those right. But a lot of what I'm going to be discussing is going to be opinion. And so I wanted to kind of present some about who I am and what my perspective is, so that way you can understand the framing that I have for my opinion. Your opinions will likely vary, and that's great. Everybody's different, and that's really cool. What's interesting to me is why you have the opinion you do. And I will try to get into why I have the opinions that I do on these. So we've got a bunch of different categories of stuff that I want to go over. I guess I might as well just give you a high-level overview by scrolling through everything. So we have some of this initial framing, what is my perspective, and all of that. World and level design, thoughts, combat mechanics, which is going to get into a lot of stuff, equipment, enemies and bosses. This might be a little scarce. I hadn't gone into that one as deeply. Talking about magic, character mechanics. So this differs from combat. Combat is going in equipment. They're talking about very specific things here. Character mechanics is going to be things like leveling up and hollowing and all that sort of stuff. And then kind of wrap up with NPCs and NPC quests. So that's a lot of stuff to get through. So this is probably going to be a pretty long video. I initially wanted to break it up into several videos, but here we are. It's going to just be a long one. So some of my first experiences, I just wanted to give some of this initial framing. I first saw Dark Souls 1 at a friend's house, and then one of them got me the Prepare to Die edition. But I didn't have any interest in playing it until I had watched a Let's Play by Geop of it, where he was guided by a couple of friends through the game. And that's really what kind of got me interested. I was excited for Dark Souls 2, but then there was this big delay before the PC release came out, and I ended up watching another Let's Play of that. So I didn't have experiences going into these games blind, unaware of what was going on, until Dark Souls 3. There is a playlist, or playthrough anyway, it's buried deep in my YouTube channel. I'll try to include a link to that in the description for those who want to see it. But a couple of important things to kind of, beyond those first experiences that I had in my notes. First of all, I'm not super boss oriented. I know a lot of people really like their bosses. For me, I'm more interested in sort of the core gameplay loop of fighting regular enemies and exploring the world. And I also really enjoy buildcraft. So this is part of why I really like Guild Wars 1. For those who've been around on my channel before or poked around, you'll notice that there is a lot of stream VODs from Guild Wars 1. And I really like that game because its emphasis is heavily on buildcraft and that sort of thing. And that's what I enjoy. So I'm not super oriented to bosses, which I know makes me a little bit different than a lot of people. And I have a lot of thoughts related to that we'll probably talk about when we get down to the boss area. Yeah, I think that's some of the preamble that I wanted to do. We'll get over it. We'll get through things as we go. So let's just go ahead and jump into world and level design. So where to start? Well, okay, so Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 all have different stuff going on, but actually I should start at, this is what happens when you don't script things super at all. I want to highlight the difference between world design and level design. Level design are individual maps. They're the stages that you play through. Say the catacombs, pick one, or one of the swamps, Blighttown, and things like that. Basically, if a big place name thing comes up, that's a level. World design is how these levels are arranged and connected together. So, I've highlighted right here that I wanted to discuss this. So there's a huge amount of impact on things based upon level design and world design. Level design, I think, has generally been fairly consistently solid across all three games. World design, however, has differed tremendously. If we look at Dark Souls 1, that world design comes in a couple of different stages. You have what I'd call the Pre-Sense Fortress stage. So the Pre-Sense Fortress stage has a bunch of loops where things connect. So you have the Undead Parish connecting to Upper Blighttown and Firelink Shrine, and off into the forest area. And so it's how do areas connect? How are you incentivized to go through them? These are all kind of important. So one of the big things that I note with most of the Dark Souls world design is that they are fairly linear. Now, Dark Souls 1, again, the first part of that is not super linear. It is, in fact, has a lot of these loops that let you go around different ways. And we'll talk about, I guess right now, the impact of the fast travel on this. Fast travel has a huge impact on this sort of gameplay loop. Hubs in particular, and this is something right here, is really important to highlight as well. So Dark Souls 2 and 3 both use an NPC for leveling up. They also have a different upgrade system where they have the infusion system plus the reinforcement. Dark Souls 1 uses a reinforcement system that then has modifications to the next tier of things. This is really important because it gives them the ability to kind of break things off. So the bonfire in Dark Souls 1 allows you to level up, and once you get the things, allows you to repair equipment, which we'll talk about equipment durability later. But it also lets you reinforce equipment up to those modifier levels. So you can get, say, your broadsword up to +5, or if it's +6 or above, you can get it up higher or whatever, provided you have the upgrade materials. So the fact that you can do a lot at bonfires means that they don't have to have the fast travel early on. Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 really need the fast travel at the start because you have to be able to go back to the Emerald Herald or Firekeeper in order to be able to spend souls on levels. Now, they could do some of the other things similar to how Dark Souls 1 does it. They could have some sort of reinforcement box. They could allow you to reinforce all the way to +10 at a bonfire and have to go to a blacksmith to infuse, for example. They could still keep their repair mechanic at the blacksmith. That would have worked because in those games you generally don't have to repair your equipment like you do in Dark Souls 1. But it's having that leveling NPC, which is a fairly consistent thing that FromSoft has done. Between Bloodborne, Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2, and Dark Souls 3. They have the NPCs that do the leveling up. that requires you to be able to easily access that NPC's location. There are different ways that you could solve this. You could solve it by having the NPC basically appear at every bonfire or at specific bonfires. But you really want to be able to enable the player to spend their souls when they get to a bonfire. This allows them to feel like they have achieved a reward for what they've been doing and enables them to bank the value that they've acquired through their play. That is really, really critical and a really important thing to be able to do. Therefore, you want to have their ability for them to do that when they get to a bonfire, and if the only way for them to spend those souls on levels is with an NPC, you have to enable them to get back to that NPC easily. Imagine in Dark Souls 1 if you had an Emerald Herald or a Firekeeper. Imagine if you had to go back to visit Anastasia to level up. Going back to Firelink Shrine in order to level would be untenable in that game with its design. And so, because you have the leveling NPCs, instead of being able to level up bonfires, you have to be able to get back to those NPCs. And that means that the fast travel is there at the beginning. But when the fast travel is there at the beginning, it means that you can kind of design... You don't have to design world shortcuts the same way. I don't know how much you all have noticed as you've been playing Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, but it just does not have shortcuts the same way that Dark Souls 1 does. You can think about it, and there are shortcuts within zones, but there are rarely, if ever, shortcuts between zones. So you can kind of see some in some areas. For example, Lothric Castle in Dark Souls 3 has a number of elevators that go back down to earlier areas, but a lot of times those elevators aren't super useful. Or they might be useful for a boss fight, for example. But it's not like the elevators between the Parish and Firelink Shrine. You don't tend to have shortcuts like that, where you've gone way around. Or the connections between Valley of the Drakes and Blighttown and the Forest of Giants and New Londo Ruins. The world is just significantly more connected than it is in Dark Souls 2 or 3. And the fast travel system means that you don't need those world connections to be able to get around as much. But it has some unfortunate consequences. I personally... Now, there's a lot of other things going on here. We'll get into them in just a second. But I personally much prefer the first half or so, the Presens Fortress part of Dark Souls 1, world design-wise, compared to the second half of Dark Souls 1, 2, or 3. 3 is the most egregious for me. It feels like there's basically no choices in how I'm progressing through the game. It's very, very linear in the way it's laid out. 2, at least you have some options of where you're going initially. And it kind of does, it spreads out and then gives you some paths to choose between. I much prefer that to what Dark Souls 3 does. However, one of the things that we also need to look at here is the Souls franchise has been growing. Right, Dark Souls 1 was kind of a surprise hit in some regards. Demon's Souls, I think, and again, I've not looked at these numbers, sales numbers or anything, but Demon's Souls was a PlayStation 3 exclusive, and it was a lot more niche. And the Dark Souls trilogy really helped bring Demon's Souls into greater, broader awareness. So Dark Souls 1 comes out, and a lot more people are playing it. And there's a lot of issues that people have with navigation. People are getting lost. People aren't going the right way. Dark Souls 1 does a really poor job of telling you where to go, particularly when you first arrive. A lot of people are going to find the skeletons heading down to the catacombs that are going to wreck them. A lot of people are going to die to ghosts. And I understand why there's the advice to pick the Master Key at the start as your starting gift. I really do. It is bad advice for new players because it opens up additional paths that just add routes for them to get lost. That's my opinion on the matter anyway. So anyway, you have a lot of potential routes, and the path that you need to take up to the aqueduct, not super visible. And so what do? Well, they try to streamline it. Again, these games have a couple of competing difficulties in terms of making them, and that you're trying, as they get bigger, they're trying to appeal to a broader audience. And so they're trying to have things continue to like be able to appeal to that broader audience while simultaneously not losing their existing audience. So they need to try to hold on to their existing audience. And so they're going to be trying to paying attention to those things, but at the same time, they want to address stuff that makes it hard for them to acquire new people, that turns people away, that makes the games difficult to grasp onto. And one of those is getting lost at the start, wandering off in areas where you're getting curb stomped by random enemies and things like that. So there's this component of things as well that's influencing how they're approaching world design specifically. It maybe has a little bit of influence on level design, but it's mostly world design and how they've arranged the way that you can kind of navigate through things. I much prefer the exploratory non-linearity of the first part of Dark Souls 1, so I'm hopeful that Elden Ring will kind of bring that back. But one of the things that I have highlighted here as well is hallways and rooms, etc. One of the things that I feel with this linearity is it makes things feel like hallways. It feels like I'm not journeying through a world, but I'm just heading towards a path, a destination. And a lot of times those are boss fights. And like I said, I am not super engaged by boss fights specifically. Like I can enjoy them, but like I don't play games for boss fights. So let's see. I also want to touch on aesthetics. One of the big things that I wanted to talk about here is Dark Souls 3 specifically has a lot of these little areas that have these really cool little aesthetic things going on that feel like they have a lot more potential and are just not used much. A big one is right by the tree boss, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, but we all know it, the transposing kiln tree. Like this, it's the stonework, it's floral, like got a lot of flowers there. It's like, oh, this is interesting, but it's just that hallway and that boss. And it's like, okay, it feels like there could be more here. There are a number of areas that feel that way to me in Dark Souls 3. Something else that I wanted to touch on, and if you noticed when I flipped through the wikis before, I have keys open. The reason why I have keys open is because I was looking through the keys. And the reason why I was doing this is because I was thinking about the use of keys in the Dark Souls franchise. Now, this might be a little weird, but the reason why I was doing it is because I've played a couple of Dark Souls 1 randomizers, and the VODs are up on my channel. And when I was playing through Dark Souls 3 again in preparation for doing this, I was really like, okay, keys don't really feel like they're a huge deal in this game, whereas they feel like they're a much bigger deal in Dark Souls 1. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The big one is keys in Dark Souls 2 to an extent and 3 are predominantly for side areas. Now, a lot of the Dark Souls 1 keys are for this as well, to be very, very clear. Things like the cage key opens up a nice shortcut, which matters a lot more in that game because you can't do bonfire warps at the point that you get the cage key. Crest of Artorias is useful. Crest key unlocks a boss fight. But a number of these, and like Key to the Depths is really important for progression. But a number of these are, like the Dark Souls 1 keys, are really, really important for progress, for being able to advance through the level. Now, this also happens in Dark Souls 2 and 3. Like, there are the Basin of Vows is really important for progression. Where is it? The Grand Archives key, the Contraption key. These are really important for progression as well, but these are gotten right before you need to use them. They're used like to lock things, but you don't have to go find the key. Compare that to the basement key in particular is what kind of stands out to my mind, because I had a couple of runs where I could not find the basement key very early at all in the randomizer. And it's like, oh, this has a huge impact on my ability to navigate the world. Additionally, the key to the New Londo Ruins, while technically very optional, you don't need to be able to go through there, you can wander around different ways, is a huge like availability of navigation. And I didn't feel like keys from Dark Souls 2 or 3 are as significant. This is kind of a more minor thing, but in some regards, like being able to open up these paths within the world itself is really significant in terms of how it feels. It's not like the basement key is all that far away, It's a bit of a ways beyond where the door actually is. And just as a reminder, the basement key itself is right in front of the Undead Parish like chapel area on the stairs going up to it, and the door is at the Tauros demon side of the Hellkite Drake Bridge, near where you can find Solaire for the first time. So being able to get that key and then open that door, like it's like, oh, I've opened up progress and things like that. But it also means that an item like the Master Key makes sense in Guild Wars 1. Like, if you think about it, the Master Key, like, what things would you even put in terms of locks that you could open with the Master Key in 2 or 3? I can't really think of much, right? Like, what the grave of what is it called? The grave key. Like, being able to open that, does that do much for you if you could just grab the master key to open it? Again, like, there's some that might be useful in terms of like getting access to side areas, but it doesn't. None of them would really open up that much navigation. So it was just something interesting to think about of like what makes the world feel intricate and interconnected. There's actually something else that I want to touch on here that I think really does a good job of highlighting some of the stuff that I'm talking about as well, because there's a lot where level design can influence sort of a lot of other things. And I think a really good example of something that Dark Souls 1 does kind of poorly is the Cat Covenant. What I mean by this is the forest area that you have to go through, you only like that area where the Cat Covenant is active between the Crest of Artorias door and the Sif boss fight. There's nothing else that you're doing in there. You're going through there to get to the Sif boss fight, and that's it. The Cat Covenant would be a lot more effective if you had reasons to cross through that forest like multiple times. If it was used for more than the Sif boss fight. I mean, obviously there's some items to explore and things like that, but if you had reason to go through it to like if it connected a couple of other important areas, such that you wanted to pass through it several times in a normal playthrough, that would make the Cat Covenant work a lot better because you'd have a lot more people populating the area to invade. So that sort of thing has a lot of impact on how the game feels and that sort of thing. Okay, let's kind of continue. I already touched on all of these. I do like the way Dark Souls 1 has a lot of variety in sort of where you find the merchants and such. The fact that Dark Souls 2 and 3, especially 3, tend to congregate merchants in the hub area really has a huge impact on, like, it creates a different feel. And I love Majula in particular, and having the NPCs show back up there and kind of repopulate the place is really neat. But having NPCs out in specific areas in the world means that being able to visit those areas more. And so, like, Andre's Black like spot, the Undead Parish bonfire is really significant. Not only is it a crossroads between like Firelink Shrine, the forest, and Sen's Fortress, it's also an area where a really important NPC is, and that makes it have a certain degree of significance because players visit areas that have meaningful things happening in them. And so, like, having multiple hubs like that, I think, is personally something that I like and find interesting. And I thought New Game Plus stuff goes here as well. I do like that Dark Souls 2 and 3 introduced new loot that you can get in greater NG Plus cycles. I think that's really good. Another example, actually, of something that's kind of like this is is it the Demon's Great Hammer? Anyway, the hammer that you can get by killing the Asylum Demon before running through the place and doing the plunge. That's kind of like this, and I think that's also a really interesting use. Bonfire Ascetics from Dark Souls 2, great idea. I really like being able to advance parts of the game. This is especially useful because it lets you kind of get a little bit more use out of your character's build without having to go all the way back to the start of the game, which can cut you off from access to things such as useful blacksmiths for doing infusions and stuff like that. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into combat mechanics. Take a drink, everyone. Stay hydrated. Okay, so this is in a lot of these are in no particular order. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about healing items based upon just the sheer amount of things here. But so we have dodge rolls and weight. This is an area where it's really interesting to see how things kind of changed over time. So the effects of lock-on specifically, just to quickly touch on this, let's just start with Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 has very specific weights. It has the 50% and less for mid-roll, under 100% for fat roll, and of course above that you just stagger when you try to dodge, and then less than or 25% and less for fast roll. It also lock on is just worse in Dark Souls 1. It really, really affects sort of your ability to dodge effectively because you have free mobility of or like free movement of dodging. I don't free angle of dodging. Let's go with that. While not locked on, but in Dark Souls 1 in particular, while you're locked on, you can only roll in 4 directions. You can roll left, right, forward, and back. And that makes it a lot harder to dodge effectively. Rolling, I think, is in its most difficult spot in terms of... Because, like... Rolling is really, really, really good as a defensive mechanic. Getting, like, the games are principally about rolling for defense. I know that there's other things that you can do. You can stack up various other stats that are maybe underappreciated in order to be able to get a lot more durable. But these games tend to be like fairly low hits, and it's hard to just tank a bunch of damage because you're running out of healing items. This is a little bit different in Dark Souls 2 just because Dark Souls 2 gives you a lot more access to healing items, and we'll talk about that. And like Dark Souls 3 is particularly where this is actually kind of rough, but the switch in Dark Souls 2 to having it be kind of a little bit of a linear adjustment to your dodge, but still kind of like making a lot more smooth of a gradient between like 0% and 70% makes it feel a lot better to wear heavier armor or to use heavier equipment in general, and kind of breaks sort of the tyranny of the 25% or less. Like you can get away with mid rolls in Dark Souls 1, like you can function there, but it feels much better to be in fast roll territory. And they also improved some of the lock-on stuff in Dark Souls 2 and 3 as well, so locking on feels a lot better. And you can see that the dodge roll change that they made, now adaptability is terrible, but changing it so that way the dodge roll has like that smoother gradient in terms of like speed and all of that between 0 and 70% just makes it a lot better feeling to put stuff on your character. And they kept that in Dark Souls 3, which I think was really good. Blocking, I don't know, this is a thing that you can do across all of the games. This is, though, where shield design is more of an equipment thing. We'll talk about shield design a bit more then. I do like blocking as a mechanic. One of the things I think is a little bit of a problem across the games, I feel like this becomes more of a problem the later you get. But blocking doesn't feel like it's a very good... Like, okay, so part of what's going on here, it doesn't feel like a very good defensive mechanic, to finish the thought. Part of what's going on here is, like, Dark Souls, the further you get, the more, like, combo potential the enemies have. So one of the issues that I, at least, find with Dark Souls 3 is that there's a lot of times where I'll be in block stun, and so I'll be stuck blocking an entire chain of attacks instead of being able... And, like, while I'm in that, I can't really move, right? So I can't, like, hold my shield up, take hits on the shield while, like, moving away. I think some of this worked a little bit more free in Dark Souls 1, or if nothing else, enemies didn't tend to combo you the same sort of way. You tended to be able to, like, have the ability to kind of move out of that. So Dark Souls 3 is a lot more punishing of a game. Like, it's just straight up is. We'll talk about that more when we get to healing items as well. But blocking, particularly in 3, Just doesn't feel as good as it does in some of the earlier ones. It just doesn't feel as effective. Now, you also have the issue of equipment with special properties, but that's equipment, so we'll get to that. Pairing and riposts. So this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. Obviously, and this is for backstab, and backstabs are kind of included in this as well. These are easiest to do in Dark Souls 1. Parry timings are a lot more generous in Dark Souls 1. Backstabs are a lot easier to land in Dark Souls 1 because you don't have to land a pre-hit. Now, I understand why they would make it so that way backstabs are less reliable in 2 and 3. And I like a lot of the backstab animations in 2, which I've mentioned. Parrying is better in 3 than it was in 2. The parry in Dark Souls 2 just feels awful. You just, like, it's hard to land, and then you have to wait for the enemy to actually fall all the way down, or you cancel them out of the animation, so you don't even get the benefit. And it, like, there's too many different parry timings, like parry windows across different things that you can parry with, which makes it just really, really hard to keep in your head, like what does what, frankly. I much prefer the spot where parrying is in Dark Souls 1. The reason why is because in Dark Souls 1, parrying is easy enough that it feels like the risk to reward ratio is in a good spot. In Dark Souls 2 and 3 even, I feel like parries are challenging enough that I'd much rather just attack the enemy and hit stun them several times. I feel like I'll get more damage that way more reliably. And the problem in Dark Souls, in Dark Souls 1, like parrying is generally reliable enough that I feel like it's not too difficult to get good enough at parrying to land them consistently enough that it's a worthwhile risk to reward. Of course, there's a lot of like personal opinion baked into that. I think we can all agree that the ease of landing parries got a bit harder over time. It's a very difficult thing to find the balance for, however, of like how easy should it be to land parries, how much damage should ripostes do, and that sort of thing. I definitely prefer the feel of parries, parry ripostes in 1 and 3 because they feel better. But yeah, I think I'd just repeat myself if I kept going here. Power stance and combat arts. So power stance was something that was added in in Dark Souls 2. Combat arts was or weapon arts, or whatever you want to call them, was what was introduced in Dark Souls 3. I really like the introduction of both of these things. I understand why they kind of switched to specific weapons that you can two-hand in Dark Souls 3. I'm glad they kept that. I will say overall, I do like the Dark Souls 3 like combat mechanics the best. Like the combat arts add a lot. There's a lot of variety to weapon movesets and things like that. Different builds feel like there are payoffs for them, although we'll get to buildcraft a bit more later on. But yeah, I don't know why they decided to get rid of power stancing. I think that was one of the cool things that Dark Souls 2 did. And then combat arts is something that I really, really like. And I think that was a really good addition. Is a good way of adding in cool, like useful functionality, reasons to go with different weapons, as well as cool special moves. And the ability to add cool special moves was something that I really liked. I really liked being able to have, sword lasers off of the prince's sword, and what's some other cool ones? There's a lot of sword lasers actually. Various ways of setting your sword on fire, the unique attack patterns of the Farron greatsword, the one from the Farron Legion. All of that stuff is really cool. Not to say that they didn't have some of that stuff in Dark Souls 1, but we'll talk about weapons a little bit more. Let's jump to healing items. Healing items are a really important part of combat, and they changed a lot over the course of the games. One of the things that I think is really interesting to look at is that Dark Souls 3 is the most stingy when it comes to healing. You have Estus, Now you get 15 Estus flasks over the course of the game. And if I may take a moment, I really wish that there was use for Estus shards and bone dust after you reach the caps on those things. Just saying. I Dark Souls 1 did that a little bit better. Dark Souls 1 Estus, I prefer the kindling system of making individual bonfires better, but obviously that's not as good for a system like Dark Souls 2 and 3. And this is where everything's kind of interconnected. Because the world design of Dark Souls 2 and 3 mean that you don't really develop hub locations. You have one hub, right? You have Majula or Firelink Shrine. Like, you have just the one hub. Otherwise, like, everything's linear, so you're not really crisscrossing paths as much. Which means you don't have those locations like the Undead Parish that you're constantly walking through because you're trying to get from one location to another. You don't have areas like, to some extent, that first bonfire in the Undead Burg, right near where the merchant is and whatnot, where you have the ladder kicked down. It's really useful to go back to that when you're in the lower Burg because there's a shortcut back up to there. And it's close to the Hellkite Drake. That's a sort of mini hub. You don't have... What are some other... There's also notably like the Ulasil Township bonfire at the top of, or just after Artorias, also is kind of a hub area because that's where you want to go fight Calamite. That's where you want to go fight Manus. So that's also kind of a sort of a hub bonfire. Again, a lot of the game afterwards becomes a lot more. After you get through after you unlock Sense Fortress, like Sense Fortress on tends to be a lot more linear because you have the sort of linear path up to the Ornstein and Smo boss fight, and then you have the some like branches off of it, but that's like to Painted World and to the Duke's Archives. Things don't like loop back around; they're just like dead ends, right? So that sort of dead ending effect means that. And that's present in 2 and 3 as well, mean that you don't tend to have, like, oh, this is an important bonfire that I want to make sure to kindle. Kindling, giving you more Estus up to 10 initially, and then once you unlock the Rite of Kindling up to 20, means that you can say, this area is harder, I want to have more Estus here. I want to invest a resource in buffing this particular bonfire, and that's something that you then carry to new game cycles. And so that's how you get more flasks in that one. And then you increase their strength with Firekeeper souls that you need a Firekeeper to reinforce the Estus flask. You can reinforce it up to +7. There are 7 Firekeeper souls. 4 on living Firekeepers and then 3 out in the world. So it's like, oh, this makes sense, but also you cannot fully max one in a new game cycle because you run into the problem of, if you get all the Firekeeper souls, there's not a Firekeeper to reinforce the last Firekeeper, like reinforce it the last time, right? Because all of the Firekeepers are dead that can do the reinforcement. So I think that's a really cool sort of thing. And if you don't kill any of the Firekeepers, it means that the 3 souls that you find out in the world, like, it's going to take you until new game plus before you get enough of those Firekeeper souls to be able to fully reinforce the Estus flask. So I think that's really interesting. So they went away from that system for Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 instead introduced, like, you start off with like an Estus flask that the Firekeeper gives you. It's very easy to get a second one fairly early on. So, there's that. But it's the sort of thing where they wanted to limit how much Estus you could get because 20 flasks at +7 could like make you super tanky. And then they decided to make all healing effects, like, instead of being instant heals, they made them regen effects. But it turns out like stacking regen was super powerful, as I have noted right here. So that didn't work too well. But one of the other things that Dark Souls 2 did is they introduced life gems. There's a ton of healing items. So if we look at the different games, Estus is obviously in all of them. Life gems are in Dark Souls 2. The medallions are in Dark Souls 2. A lot of people don't seem to know about the medallions. The medallions are these consumable items that you can use to heal you and also cure you of poison. So if I go to the Dark Souls 2 wiki and I go to items, and consumables. So you have the Estus Flask, obviously. 3 different tiers of life gems. Elizabeth's mushrooms. You have the herbs to restore magic casts. There's no way to restore magic casts. We'll talk about magic more, but there's no way to restore magic casts initially. But you also have the monastery charms and the dragon charms. These cure poison and heal you for a bunch of HP, and people don't seem to really know that that's what they do, it seems like, from stuff that I've seen. But these are also additional healing items, which is quite potent. There's also the Rouge Water and the Crimson Water, which restore spell uses and also heals HP. Dried Root heals HP, but very slowly. Dark Souls 2 feels way more RPG than the other ones. There's a ton of really useful consumable items and stuff. So Dark Souls 1 has your Estus Flask, your Elizabeth's Mushrooms, which I clearly forgot about because I don't use them. But the medallions, the Divine Blessings. Dark Souls 1 has... We'll get to that one in a moment. The Rouge and Crimson Water. Dark Souls 1 does have humanity that you can heal with, but this is in limited supply, and you may not want to. All of them also have Divine Blessings. Dark Souls 3 is super limited in healing items. You have Estus, which comes in a fairly limited amount, which you have to balance between healing your HP and healing your FP. There is Divine Blessings and the other FP equivalent, Hidden Blessing. But the problem with Divine Blessing is in that game is you can only carry one. Like, they're like, we're being super limited here. And then there's Siegbrow, which is not a very strong heal. Like, it's not nothing, but it's not very strong. So Dark Souls 3 also, it seems to use kind of a faster regen. Maybe this actually specifies how it works specifically. No, I wanted just regular Estus. Yeah, okay, so this restores some HP when used. So the Estus Flask in Dark Souls... Actually, just clicking on this brings us to more details about the Estus Flask. Because it seems to restore... Wow, yeah, they feel super weak. It seems to restore it as a slightly... Interesting. So there's a lot of stuff here. Okay, I'm getting kind of caught up in scanning this mechanics thing. But it seems to have a slight sort of like regen effect that then gets halted when you take damage. Like, Estus is just, it's not as strong as it feels like in the other ones. Does this one actually specify? I'm just looking at information now as I'm... Like, this is something that I would have done previously had I been approaching things differently. So Estus Flask... Yes. Okay, so it is stronger. A +3 Estus in Dark Souls 1 is equivalent to a +10 Estus in Dark Souls 3. Okay, so how strong is the Estus Flask here? Okay, so it's like +50. Wow. It starts at 550 HP? Yeah, it's... This Estus Flask is much stronger. Up to a maximum of 800 HP. Okay, then. Yeah, which is where that one caps out at. So, anyway, Dark Souls 3 has the weakest Estus. It seems very easy for the healing from it to be, like, interrupted or something even. I don't know. Maybe that's just, like, taking damage. You have to split it between that and Ashen Estus if you want to use magic. It's just way more restrictive on actual heals, which, like, is a choice. Like, it's a choice that they made. And obviously they kind of wanted to move things that way. But it definitely feels like a little too far, in my personal opinion, in terms of limiting healing options. I liked having a consumable like Humanity that would be a full heal, but of limited quantity that you could actually bring with you. I think Dark Souls 2 gave you too much healing. Now, one of the things to note here, Estus, just kind of jumping around as I'm looking at this, Estus in 1 and 2 root you in place while you're using it. Dark Souls 3 does the same sort of thing that Dark Souls 2 does with life gems, and this is something that I think was really good that Dark Souls 2 introduced. Estus is very strong in Dark Souls 2, but you can't move while doing it. While life gems are weaker, but you can move while activating them. And the ability to move while using your healing item was really, really nice for like the feel of combat. It made you feel less like stuck in place and stuff, and more mobile. Which is something that I think was a really good innovation for them to bring forward into Dark Souls 3. One of the things, though, that they were also dealing with that affects combat is the game having a reputation for being hard. And so they're definitely like, how do we keep that? How do we appeal to the hardness that the game has a reputation for? And my impression is that the goal wasn't to make the games hard for the sake of being hard, but to make them hard for the sake of being rewarding. And so you need something to actually overcome. I will say as well that I think Embers are a really clever way of introducing a sort of like one-shot heal. Embers will heal you and like fully, but you can only use it while unembered. Unlike Humanity, which you can just keep popping. So a lot of differences in the healing items. Obviously, we mentioned herbs as well for spellcasts, and Elizabeth mushrooms that I forgot about for strong health regen. Friggin' overcomes, like Dark Souls 1, Elizabeth mushrooms will overcome the life degen from Toxic by the Blighttown Toxic Dart guys. Fun fact. So if somehow you've gotten access to Elizabeth mushrooms already before going there. So the healing items, of course, are a really important backbone of the games as well. But I feel like I've kind of talked through this stuff sufficiently. It is interesting to see how those things change over time, though, where they start off with Estus, and they're like, maybe giving the player the ability to bring bonfires up to 20 Estus and carry, however many divine favors they can find and a bunch of humanity in order to heal. Maybe the way that we did this is not exactly how we want it, so they adjusted things with Dark Souls 2. They gave us the ability to get our spellcasts back and all of that, but then they're like, okay, maybe we gave them way too much healing. Let's tone that down for Dark Souls 3. I hope Elden Ring kind of finds a better balance. I know that FromSoft has experimented a lot with some of this, like healing items, because they're so important. From the Grass and Demon Souls to Blood Vials and Bloodborne as well. Some other stuff. There's a spot to be found. I think if I were to give my opinion for what I think would be best, I actually think it's probably best to not have these heal flat amounts. I think it's better to do kind of more what I understand. I haven't played Bloodborne. I've just seen a lot of gameplay of it, and my understanding is that heals a certain percentage of your HP. I think that's a better route to go. You can still do reinforcement where you increase the percentage that any given one heals. It leads to a different playstyle, though. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into equipment. About 50 minutes in. Woo! So there's a lot of different types of equipment. And there's weapons, armor, rings, and then, of course, durability to touch on. Okay, so let's just go ahead and start at weapons. Upgrade methods is the first thing that I have here. I think this is really interesting. Again, Dark Souls 1 takes after Demon Souls to an extent. It has a much more complicated upgrade system where you can get up to plus things, and then it branches off. So you have like your base weapon, you can bring it up to +5, and then you can modify it to be like magic, enchanted, fiery, divine, raw, or +6. And then like from those branch off. So like divine +9 can be made into divine +10 up to 15, or is it 10? No, you go up to 10, and then you can bring it up to 11 up to 15, or you can make it a cult. Fire can go to fire +15 or chaos +5. Raw doesn't go anywhere. I personally think raw should have gone to crystal. I think crystal should have been an evolution of raw. That just like continues the no attribute scaling, just raw damage sort of thing. But that's another matter. And then at +10, you can either ascend to a boss weapon if you have a boss soul, and it's a weapon type that can become the boss weapon. We'll talk about boss weapons in just a moment. or you can make it lightning, crystal, or bring it up to +11, up to +15. So, like, this is a much more complicated system for doing weapon upgrades. There's a couple of benefits to it. It allows you to spread out Titanite use because the divine magic and fire paths use green Titanite shards rather than large shards. And then fire weapons use red chunks and slabs. Magic weapons use blue chunks and slabs, and divine/occult weapons use white chunks and slabs. So this ability to kind of split stuff up allows you to kind of it allows you to be able to kind of shift stuff around a little bit. It also gives you some flexibility with other types of builds, because one of the things with you need a lot of different resources for going into magic is kind of what it comes down to. So it gives you the ability to have some of these side weapons. Like if you're like, I'm going strength, it allows you to be able to say, oh, if I want to make a divine weapon for helping me fight the skeletons in the catacombs, because a divine weapon, like dealing divine damage to them, makes them stay dead rather than them getting back up, right? That's super useful. So if you want to be able to deal divine damage, you can make a divine weapon and spend green shards on that without having to waste shards that you'd otherwise use for upgrading your main weapon that actually deals damage. So that's really nice, for example. Or it lets you make a secondary fire weapon really easily without having to spend stuff that you're using on your main weapon. I think that it, like, there's not a reason to not make like a fire weapon, for example, with your red chunks, unless you want to spend your red chunks like feeding them to Frampt or something. And I personally kind of prefer that. I think it creates some interesting stuff with the gameplay. But I also recognize that it's a lot more complicated, it's a lot more convoluted, it's a lot less clear. So the switch to infusion, I think, was a more straightforward thing, even if I personally like the complicated thing a little bit more. I do like that they made lightning scale with faith. I tend to prefer faith builds for some reason, even though they've never been. I feel like if you're going to go magic route, sorcery has always been better than faith. There's maybe some exceptions with the first one. I'm wanting to review infusions actually, because there's a lot of interesting. Yeah. Oh yes, we need to talk about upgrade materials as well. Okay. So faint stone reduces magic damage scaling. Do you have a thing where you just say what those are? Okay, well let's just glance at this. Magic stone removes current item scaling to add intelligence based on physical scaling. Some of these were a little bit more complicated. Bolt stone. Oh right, yeah. Because Dark Souls 2, it's very easy to forget this. Dark Souls 2 is super weird. It doesn't have direct stats. It has a lot of indirect stats where lightning, you have a lightning damage value that then scales with other stuff. So the weapon, if a weapon's like your weapon doesn't scale directly off of faith, it scales indirectly off of lightning. So like lightning could be buffed by faith. It's complicated. I also, while I'm talking about upgrade materials or upgrade methods, I really should spend some time talking about upgrade materials. So, something that's consistent across the games is that they use a shard, large shard, chunk, slab system, as well as some side stuff. So, there are three basic sort of upgrade paths. There's standard, which uses your Titanite shards and chunks and slabs. There is boss, which uses a different thing in each game, because why not? Demon Titanite, Petrified Dragonbone, and is it Titanite Scales? There's I don't know why they changed it each time, but they did. And then there's Twinkling Titanite. Dark Souls 3 does this really annoying thing where it makes slabs very required for each upgrade path. So I'm somebody who likes to have a lot of different weapons available. Now, having a second and third and fourth weapon, like you get diminishing returns the more weapons you have fully upgraded. Like the first one matters a lot, the second one matters some, the third one is potentially meaningful. So, like as an example, maybe you have a sword, a bow, and a shield. Upgrading all of those means a lot. Maybe you have a caster implement. Dark Souls 3, you can upgrade your caster implements. Dark Souls 1, you can't. As just a couple of examples of where that's different. So putting your like having slabs to be able to finish off stuff is kind of significant, obviously, because getting a max weapon generally matters. Not always. Some shields, for example, their stability doesn't go up any when you get them up to whatever their max is. So Twinkling Titanite is just, it starts at 0 and it goes to +5 and that's it. And boss weapons start at 0 and go to +5 with the caveat that they're technically a +10 weapon at base in Dark Souls 1 because they come off of a +10 weapon. All of these games have problems for me. So because I like to have a bunch of weapons upgraded, and like I said, after the first maybe 5-ish weapons you fully upgraded, your returns are probably pretty strong for your first two to three things that you fully upgraded. Main weapon, shield, and maybe a secondary weapon. You get lesser returns on that fourth thing, and then they just really start dropping off after the fifth one because how many things are you actually realistically carrying in weapon slots? You're worrying about equipment burden, so you can only carry so many things, and so on and so forth. So if you're continuously upgrading weapons, my point here is they make it really, really hard to get maxed out weapons in these games. In the sort of if you wanted to have a maxed out version of everything, it's a pain in the rear end. Dark Souls 1 has the problem that it's not too bad to get, you can buy shards and large shards / green shards, but otherwise you're spending a bunch of time farming enemies. Getting chunks of any variety is a pain. Getting slabs of any variety, good luck. Drop rates are super low. It's trying to farm stuff to upgrade things is a huge pain in the rear end. You can technically buy Twinkling Titanite off of the giant blacksmith if I remember correctly. I might not, because maybe my brain's gotten confused by randomizers. Let's double check that. Upgrades materials. Unique weapons. Yeah, here's the entire thing that they have on the wiki for the different upgrade routes, by the by. I personally think, I forgot dragon weapons. Oh well. Dragon weapons are real cool. They never came back. Yeah, because they got rid of tail weapons. I think it's Twinkling Titanite. Sold by the giant blacksmith. Yeah, okay, so you can buy it from the giant blacksmith. I have distinct memories of farming the man-eater shells for Twinkling Titanite, and then souls to buy more Twinkling Titanite to try to upgrade everything. But at least there was somewhere where you could buy it. You couldn't buy Demon Titanite anywhere and had to farm the one Titanite demon that respawned in Lost Izalith on the bridge. That was terrible. So, trying to fully upgrade everything in that game was a giant pain. Dark Souls 2 is better. You can buy shards, large shards, and chunks from Cloan by the time you reach the end of the game. There's nowhere to buy slabs, but there's infinitely respawning enemies in the basement of Drang Lake Castle that they infinitely respawn because they need to in order to be able to make sure you can power the soul doors. But those stone soldiers can drop slabs, and if you are stacking gold serpent rings and stuff, you can get a decent drop rate off of them. So you can farm up slabs. Dark Souls 3 is like, on the one hand, it does the best in so much as you can buy literally every upgrade material that you need. I mean, infusions is a different matter, but you can buy every upgrade material in terms of shards, large shards, twinkling titanite, even the titanite scales and twinkling titanite, which Dark Souls 2 does not let you buy twinkling titanite and petrified dragonbone, which is a giant pain in the butt. I have a bonfire, and I think I showed this off in the Dark Souls 2 retrospective somewhere, but I have a bonfire. I distinctly remember listening to audiobooks while farming petrified dragonbone and twinkling titanite off of a chest in the Sunken King DLC, because there's a chest that you could respawn with bonfire aesthetic and like maybe get an aesthetic along the way or something. I don't remember, but it's at like 99. It's beyond that, but it doesn't show beyond that. Just from farming those, because you couldn't buy them anywhere. Souls were really easy to farm in that game, but anyway. So Dark Souls 3 makes it so that way you can buy all of those materials, but everything requires a slab to be able to get to max. So before is like, oh, you can sidestep the need for slabs by using enough boss upgrade material or twinkling titanite. But in Dark Souls 3, it's like, nope, you can get them up to +4, but to get to +5, you're going to need a slab. And then it's extremely like, these are very specific slabs. None of there's no way to farm slabs. You just have to do new game cycles. And it's like, why did you have to go so restrictive on this? What's the point of being so restrictive? You should have just made the merchant able to, like, maybe you have to kill Soul of Cinder, and then like you'll get, I don't know, Ashes of a Cinder or something that you can turn into her to buy stuff. I mean, they make his armor appear, so they just make it so that way you could just buy infinite slabs. She sells one slab, but I think they should have made it so you could just buy slabs, because at that point, what does it matter how many weapons you upgrade? Just make it easier for me to upgrade things if I want to, game. So all of them have a problem with making it hard to fully upgrade as many weapons as you want. Like, stop wasting my time and let me upgrade stuff at a certain point. Like, I understand you have your pacing and all of that. Cool. Keep that. But at a certain point, when I've gotten to the end of the game, you should let me upgrade everything. That's that rant. Okay. So boss weapons. I love boss weapons, by the way. Did I cover this enough? I don't know. I like infusions. I think in terms of like making things more streamlined, and I think it was good that they continued it. I liked how they handled it in Dark Souls 3 over Dark Souls 2. I should have touched on this earlier, but whatever. In Dark Souls 2, it's one ember that you have to find to give to Macduff, and then he can do every infusion. Andre can do some infusions that are off the bat, but then you have to find embers to be able to do more. I like having that to unlock paths for upgrading stuff and infusing stuff. I think it was slightly more meaningful to find embers in Dark Souls 1, because I feel like the modification system makes that feel more important. Because in Dark Souls 2 and 3, you can get a +10 weapon because it capped out at 10 instead of 15. You're going to get a +10 weapon sort of regardless of infusion, and infusions just allow you to kind of customize it to your build better. So the embers in 3, while meaningful because they unlock more infusions, do not lock progress for upgrading your weapon. That's only through Titanite and what they give you, like accessibility and availability of different Titanites. So they can be a little bit more loose with how easily you can get Titanite in Dark Souls 1, because like you can get chunks early on, for example, off of Black Knights. So having more, because they have the limiter on how powerful you can make your weapon by where you find the embers. So, and then that can kind of also incentivize, like, oh, maybe you want to make your weapon lightning because you're able to get access to the NPC to make it lightning. And that's not locked behind an ember, whereas getting to +11 requires you to get the very large ember from the New Londo ruins. Just, there's some nuance there. But I like what they did with splitting it up so that way different embers enable different infusions. And I think that was kind of a good sort of middle ground solution. Okay, boss weapons. So I really like boss weapons. I think this is one of the coolest things that the Dark Souls games do, that I don't know what we want to call them. Did they? I don't know. I haven't played Bloodborne. We're not talking about Bloodborne here. But I really love boss weapons. I like them having special properties. I like them doing distinct and unique things. This is something that I think has consistently gotten better over the course of the franchise. Dark Souls, in terms of like functionality of boss weapons, as well as the introduction of more boss spells. Technically, Dark Souls 1 does have a boss spell. You can get Pursuers off of the Soul of Manus by trading it with a crow. But overall, it's mostly just boss weapons that you have to get something up to plus 10, or if it's a catalyst, not. And then you can use the boss soul in order to be able to make it into a boss weapon. I think having the trade system is better, that they introduced with 2 and then continued in 3. I think that's better. It makes it like... Okay, so there's a couple of different things. In 2, there's 2 NPCs that you went to for doing trades, Ornifex and Strayed. Having it at just one spot with the Transposing Kiln in 3, I think is for the best. It makes it clear what options you have with it, so you don't have to take it to both NPCs to figure out if there's different things you can get from it. I think that was a thing that could happen. Now I'm having to... See, this is where having like scripted everything out would have been better, but whatever. Okay, so Ornifex, fossil trades. Let's see. So you can like, because Strayed had spells more where, she didn't necessarily. Ornifex didn't necessarily. So like. Skeleton Lord's Soul. Could she do anything with the Skeleton Lord's Soul? I don't remember if they had overlap in terms of like if they... Okay. Old Pale Drake's Soul. I could see that being something where they could both do it. Yeah. Okay, so they both could do something with Old Pale Drake's Soul. Ornifex could make it into a weapon, and Strayed could make it into a spell. So that's what I was wanting to confirm. Needing to take it to both NPCs, Ornifex being a little bit more of a pain in the rear end to get to, a little bit more, but needing to take it to both NPCs to double check, okay, which one of you can do something with this, and can both of you do something with this, and which would I prefer? I think it's just a lot cleaner and a lot more straightforward to have it in one spot. And as much as I think that there was some really cool stuff that you could do with the Dark Souls 1 thing, particularly the Greatsword of Artorias, which, for those who don't know, comes in 2 varieties. If you make it off of like just a sword, a normal sword, you get the Cursed Greatsword, which allows you to fight ghosts and is arguably the better one. If you use a broken sword, there's 2 different ones, either the starting broken sword hilt or the one that's dropped by hollows. That's the broken sword hilt. You get it to plus 10, you can get the true Artorias Greatsword, which is unfortunately hot garbage. It does split damage, and it just doesn't scale enough to do enough damage that way to be worth using, whereas the Cursed one does pure physical damage and therefore hits harder, and is therefore a better weapon. But I feel like if they did Artorias' Greatsword in terms of the way that the true one or whatever, the non-cursed version worked in Dark Souls 1, it would work better in the future games. It scaled with strength, dex, int, and faith, so it scaled with like everything. But even if you were maxing out all of your stats, it still had really bad damage because of the way that they ended up nerfing split damage, because it ended up being too powerful. And they kind of over nerfed it, in my opinion. But I've kind of gotten a little off track. So yeah, very cool system. I like how it changed over time to just make it a little bit more streamlined. Not having to get specific weapons up to the appropriate level meant that you're not having to spend a bunch of time and souls on acquiring Titanite in order to get it there, which is good. And it also made it a lot clearer what you could do with the weapon. I think this is really important. If you don't know what you can do with any given boss soul in Dark Souls 1, you might have to upgrade a bunch of different things. Like, do you know what the soul of Quaylog can be used for. Now, you can make Quaylog's Fury Sword or the Chaos Blade off of a katana or a curved sword, but the game doesn't tell you that. Like, you just have to upgrade stuff and be like, oh, I can do stuff with boss souls, and then figure out what things you can do with boss souls. It is a little too obscure. Whereas the Dark Souls 2 and 3 method of having an NPC that you trade with is like, oh, okay, I can clearly see what things I can do with this boss soul, and that's neat. And so yeah, I'm really happy to see them get more unique effects and work better and be cool and interesting, and I want Elden Ring to have cool boss weapons because it's cool. Damage types, what I think is interesting is how they kind of handled this over time. I don't think they've really added damage types per se, because it's usually been, I guess I added Dark. Dark was not in Dark Souls 1. It was just magic. So they had magic, lightning, weird stuff with the occult and divine that was sort of pseudo damage that I still don't quite understand. And then the what is it? Yeah, I think those your standard physical types of like slashing, piercing, and blunt or striking or whatever the heck you want to call it. And then 2 introduced Dark, and 3 kept that going. So I think that what's really interesting to me is that Dark Souls 2 has weapon buffs working better if it has that damage type base. So like Dark Weapon would increase the percentage of dark damage that a weapon would deal. So if it was already dark, you could apply Dark Weapon to it, and it would do way better than if you applied it to something else. And then they changed that again for 3 to be like, oh no, you can't apply buffs to these things that have specific damage types. So armor, I don't want to spend a lot of time on armor. I talked a lot about what's relevant regarding armor in the previous section on combat mechanics. But I do want to highlight that Dark Souls 1 and 2 allow you to upgrade armor, and Dark Souls 3 doesn't. I think this is the right move. Dark Souls 1 had some armor sets that you couldn't upgrade. As I recall, you could upgrade every armor set in Dark Souls 2. There might be a few exceptions. But being able to make armor better is like pumping up. Weapons are what's fun and cool about Dark Souls. Armor is not. Like, obviously, Fashion Souls is a thing, but like, I prefer not pumping a bunch of upgrade materials and like including Titanite slabs into my armor. And the fact that Dark Souls 3 doesn't have armor upgrading, I think, is a huge plus, and the general direction that I want to see things go. Especially because there's lots of reasons to like want to be able to change your armors for different fashions, right? If you've invested a bunch of resources in upgrading a specific armor set, it kind of locks you into that armor set in a way. So giving you more flexibility to change armors, to be able to change up your fashion, to be able to meet specific challenges of specific areas, or like specific boss fights. Like, how many of you were like, oh, maybe these enemies that are using a bunch of magic on me, I should look through my armor and find the armor that gives me the best magic resist, right? I think we've all kind of like been there where we've looked for the best resist for the sorts of things we're facing. Or even like, oh, I have changed how much equipment burden I can carry. Maybe I can increase the weight of armor that I'm using. Like, all that sort of stuff means that being able to be flexible with armor is really valuable, and having the upgrading on armor is not great because of some of those things. So, I do like how they've overall like increased armor options, and a lot of armor looks better as you go over the course of the game, just from improved tech, particularly cloth armor. But that's a separate thing. That's more background technological upgrades. And I appreciate that Dark Souls 3 does a lot to try to bring old favored sets back. And that's something that I really appreciate that it does, while introducing its own new styles. Rings. Okay, so this is something that has changed a lot over the course of the trilogy. Dark Souls 1 has 2 ring slots. Dark Souls 2 and 3 have 4 ring slots. Obviously, they decided to keep that with it. personally, now there's a lot of asterisks around this. I personally think the 2 ring slots is better. Now, the reason why I say that has to go into the design of rings. You can see competition between rings being something that I mentioned. Quickly, before I go into that, a couple of other things of note of changes. Dark Souls 2 introduced weight and durability for rings. So Dark Souls 1 rings did not have durability. They did not have weight. They are all weightless. Which, I mean, how heavy is a ring, realistically? But it's a game balance mechanic, so we're going to ignore that. Dark Souls 3 dropped durability for rings, but kept weight. So I think that's kind of interesting of a change. Having your rings break definitely had an impact on things, though. And certain rings, like the dragon rings, being fairly fragile, like they're the favor and protection equivalent, which, of course, Ring of Favor and Protection is back in Dark Souls 3. Because Dark Souls 3 had a really difficult time. Like, they had to try to figure out how they were finding the line between Dark Souls 1 and 2 and what things to bring from each one. And hopefully I've been doing an okay job of highlighting that throughout this. But so going back to the slot count, the reason why I prefer 2 slots is because of the competition between rings. I think that there are design things that you could do to address this in 2 and 3, but what I have generally found is that there are rings that always feel good. Okay, so yeah, let's just go through this list of stuff. These are generally different categories of rings, right? So rings will generally fall into one of these categories in terms of usefulness. This is the point on competition between rings. It's like, what rings do you want to equip and why? So there are categories of rings that are always good. Havel's ring is always good. Favor and Protections or the Dragon Rings, always good because they increase stats that are good to increase. The Chloranthy ring for stamina regeneration, always good. There are a couple of others like this that are like, these rings are like always good. Wolf ring in Dark Souls 1 comes to mind as well. Like giving yourself plus 40 poise in Dark Souls 1 is huge. That ring is always good. There are the build dependent rings. So these are things like the Sorcerer's Ring, Ring of the Sun's Firstborn, that improve the functionality of a specific build. Often these are for casters. And then there's environment-dependent rings. So these are like the Rusted Iron Ring. This is more of a Dark Souls 1 thing than a Dark Souls 2 or 3 thing as well, I should add. So in Dark Souls 1, you have Rusted Iron Ring, you have Covenant of Artorias, which is necessary for the boss fight. That makes you change up what rings you have equipped. And you have the Orange Charred Ring that lets you run through lava without instantly combusting. I don't remember Dark Souls 2 or 3 really having any rings like this. I mean, I can quickly scan through their rings. That's not hard to look up. Where would they put them? I would assume they'd be under equipment. So maybe the items/armor? Rings. Let's see. I don't think any of these let you... Oh, technically, there's the King's Ring that lets you get access to the King's area. But you can just kind of put that on and then take it off. So I think if I were to go for like an ultimate sort of... Like Ring of Blades is another example of a generically good ring. Ring of Binding is one that's like more situational. It's kind of an environmental dependent one or situationally useful. The Ring of Binding. Let's see, Life Protection, Ring of Prayer, Restoration is not very good. Ring of the Dead, Ring of the Embedded. Yeah, I think a lot of these... Silver Cat Ring is somewhat environmentally... Okay, I'll grant this, the Silver Cat Ring is an environmental one. Since that reduces fall damage, that's environmentally useful. Boy, there's a lot of different rings. So yeah, mostly though, this is a set of, and this is going to be the same for 3 as well. They don't really tend to have environmental rings, like the Rust Iron Ring or the Covenant of Artorias or whatever, that are like, oh, you're in this environment, so you need to wear this ring to be able to mitigate the effects of it, or be able to exist in it. Then there's the situationally useful one. Those are things like the stone plate rings or other rings that are like, oh, this helps you specifically deal with enemies in this area. And then there's random stuff like the exploding ring from Dark Souls 2. This is also going to include things like the appearance changing rings. Hiding your weapon is maybe build dependent, maybe environment dependent. You can argue on that one. So yeah, there's different things that way. The issue that you run into is, for the most part, like environment dependent rings like the Rest of Iron Ring have the potential to be necessary in certain areas, like the Covenant of Artorias or the Orange Shard Ring. So they can change up what rings you use. But most of the time, it's very difficult to displace an always good ring. It's difficult to displace the Chloranthy ring or whatever. Chloranthy in particular tends to be stuck on there, and sometimes the build-dependent rings as well. Basically, what I'm saying is, Dark Souls rings are really tricky to balance well, and having them all occupy one ring slot. This is where, if I'm comparing them to something, Hollow Knight's charm system is a much better implementation of the ring idea. Because different charms can take up different number of slots, they can be assigned a different value. And weight kind of feels like it's trying to play in this area, but generally doesn't matter enough in Dark Souls 3 to really have a huge impact on what rings I'm wanting to use. So most of the time, I'm going to favor the always good rings, that you're always going to want, like the ability to carry more equipment or have more maximum stamina and equip load and stuff, or more stamina regeneration, which is really important in games that are, have stamina as a backbone. Or I might go with build dependent rings. And sometimes this is not build dependent in the sense that, like, these rings are good because of builds. Sometimes builds are good because of these rings. And I feel that this is absolutely the case in Dark Souls 3 when it comes to magic, but we'll get to that. Sometimes I'll use situationally useful ones, but a lot of times the random stuff is just, I don't want to invest a ring slot on it because I'm losing capability. I think that there are different ways that you could kind of address this as well. You could make it so that way, for lack of a better term, you have different like fingers, and each finger has a set of rings that can go on it. Or you could have rings that sort of compete with each other along a different axis. So, for example, maybe like equipping these 2 rings gives you a special set bonus or some sort of other synergy. Like, I think that they just needed to do more to make it interesting to pair rings in different ways and not just always be like, welp, I have Chloranthy and the Favor and Protection ring and Havel's ring, and or like oftentimes a dragon ring or serpent ring, right, to increase soul gain, silver serpent ring or gold serpent ring or both. Like, those fit into the always good category, particularly the silver serpent ring to giving you more souls. So having only 2 slots in Dark Souls 1 means that the always good rings have to compete against each other in a way that's not true in the other games, because there's only just so many rings that you can make in that sort of like upper echelon of rings, right? So the fact that I have to choose between Wolf Ring, Chloranthy Ring, Havel's Ring, Favor and Protection, which maybe I don't want to use because it breaks if I remove it, so it's really restrictive. The fact that I have to choose between which 2 of those 4 I'm going to use means that there's actual competition between rings. Whereas and then the fact that there's environment dependent ones, particularly the ones that are kind of required of the Orange Shard ring, and which is technically optional, but the Orange Shard ring and the Covenant of Artorias, the fact that those are basically required for the most part and take up a ring slot mean that I'm really having to make decisions about what rings to use. So the idea of rings is great, but like for 4 ring slots, I need something. I need the always good rings to, first of all, provide me more information so I can kind of evaluate them a little bit better. Chloranthy in particular, but in but notably, I need the build dependent rings or some of the random stuff to feel. I mean, it's hard to make random stuff be good enough to displace the always good rings without making them new always good rings. So I need the build dependent rings or the situationally useful or environment dependent rings to be strong enough to displace the always good rings, right? I need something that's saying, oh, you're playing a caster. Well, it's not like, yes, Dark Souls 3 has 2 stacking rings. I believe they stack. My understanding was that they stacked. Let's just go double check that. Rings. So like we have where like maybe you want to use clutch ring. But you have the where are they? They're very low down on this list, is what I'm seeing. Yeah, Morn's Ring increases the AR of miracles by 12%. Right, and I believe this stacks with Ring of the Sun's Firstborn. Right, so you can use both to, as far as I'm aware. Maybe I need to double check that. But because they're not the same ring, I'm pretty sure they both work. So, like, yeah, that kind of occupies slightly more space. But overall, it's just one of those things where I want to have reasons to change up what rings I'm using on a per character basis. And I feel like a lot of the time the always good rings are just rings that I'm always going to use because they're always good. And it's very difficult to have stuff displace those. Especially because 2 and 3 don't really have the environment dependent rings as much. Sometimes situationally useful stuff will. I've gone on this point long enough though. If they have rings in Elden Ring, which given the name, you'd kind of feel like maybe they would. I hope that they examine the design of them, either so that way they're not putting in things like Havel's Ring or Chloranthy Ring or whatever, or if they are, they're doing it in a way where it fits certain builds but not all builds. But I'd rather them focus on things that are more build dependent, where, oh, I have a reason to use this ring with this build but not with this build, and things like that. And then there's equipment durability, which is just the last thing I wanted to touch on when talking about equipment, which of course changed a good bit between 1, 2, and 2 and 3 use the same sort of thing. In 1, like, so you have equipment durability, but for the most part, it's unlikely that you're going to break anything. You do have to repair stuff at bonfires for a bit of souls. There's some benefit to having systems like this that kind of use up souls, but in many regards, I think switching to the durability systems where if you overuse equipment, it will break. Honestly, I don't think that they really need durability, especially with FP being able to be used for weapon skills. In 2, it was made relevant because weapons were super fragile in that game, particularly the PC version, where it was like per frame they would get knocked on durability, and it did let you do cool stuff like Santier's Spear, which was a really neat idea. But overall, like, automatic refill of all of your durability at bonfires meant that it was effectively a non-mechanic. It does introduce some ability for things to break in terms of equipment and make you have to like change, oh, what stuff am I using now? But because their weapon upgrade system, particularly as you get towards Dark Souls 3, Dark Souls 3 makes it really hard to go beyond like 1, maybe 2 weapons that you're upgrading, just in terms of the resources that you're getting, at least until you get far enough to start actually buying unlimited quantities of Titanite. That having a backup weapon is just not super realistic, or not super easy to do, relatively speaking. So, like, weapon durability, I don't feel like they're getting much use out of that system, if that makes sense. It doesn't really add a whole lot to gameplay. If it was something where losing durability would slowly degrade your weapon damage, then of course you'd be inclined to polish it and everything. But that plays better with a Dark Souls 1 style of durability than Dark Souls 2 or 3. And frankly, I just don't think it adds enough to have be a thing, if that makes sense. Equipment that breaks should just be in the category of like the life rings, where it's okay, it's broken, it's gone. And it should be only specific stuff that can break, I think. So I'm glad to see that they kind of overall decreased it. Yeah, that's my thoughts there. Okay, enemies and bosses. So obviously I didn't expand on this category very much, and I am looking at this right now and regretting my life choices. But some notes. One of the things that I really like that Dark Souls does is generally keep enemies threatening throughout the course of the game. I'm just trying to figure out where is a good place to start. So you have a lot of similar categories of enemies with generic hollows and things. In general, I prefer enemies in which you can engage on multiple axes. So what I mean by that is the more they're like players, the better. The more you can do things like parry and backstab them, the better. But it is good to have a variety of enemies, and all of the games do a decent job of this, as I generally recall. Boss design, I think. See, I'm just trying to think through. One of the things that's really important to be aware of when making a game is that you can kind of determine what things are good based upon what things the player runs into. So this includes environmental hazards. So for example, what makes purple moss relevant is poison swamps, for example, or enemies that can poison you. If like you could put purple moss in a game, but if it was very rare to get poisoned, it doesn't really matter. And likewise, like armor that's good against certain damage types, or being able to inflict certain damage types that enemies are weak to. Like those sorts of things can adjust where difficulty is. So, for example, if you have a zone where all the enemies are weak to fire, then anybody who deals fire damage is going to find that zone easier because they deal more damage. If you have another area where all the enemies super resist fire, then somebody who specializes in fire damage is going to find that zone way harder because everything's resisting them. So that kind of tweaks challenge. I think something like that works better if you have more flexibility of where you're going to some extent. And I think a game with feedback systems and whatnot, the way Dark Souls typically has them, is harder to do that sort of thing with in a really meaningful way. Like figuring out what enemies are weak to and trying to select for their weakness is maybe interesting with bosses. I think it can be interesting to do with normal enemies, but you have to vary it up. But you also have to not make it too strong of a system. Otherwise, it makes things too much of a slog. It's a challenging thing. But like, what sort of things can your shield block? Like, what damage types can your shield block? Becomes really relevant when you have... did I mean to talk about shields more in equipment? I didn't really touch on shields or bows or any of that sort of stuff. They definitely made bows a lot more usable in later ones where you have a little bit more mobility. Being able to snipe enemies is useful. I did mean to talk about shields. Before we continue on enemies, let's talk about shields a little bit. And this applies to armor as well. Things with passive special properties on them tends to be really good. So this, for example, the Grass Crest Shield that has stamina regeneration. Players are going to tend to gravitate towards those sorts of things. Another example is the Shield of Want from Dark Souls 3. That gives you passive increased soul quantities. Jester's Armor in Dark Souls 2 that makes you immune to backstabs. Things like this tend to be really strong. I think those passive effects can be really cool on pieces of equipment, but it also means that players are generally incentivized to gravitate to that equipment. And having other balancing features, like, for example, if you can't, like, Grass Crest Shield gets progressively worse at blocking. Like, or stamina regen shields tend to be worse at blocking, particularly in Dark Souls 2. Like, having that sort of thing is really useful for balancing stuff. Making the Grass Crest Shield not able to do useful things that shields otherwise can do is a good way of kind of like balancing it. But having those passive effects is just inherently really strong and difficult to kind of balance effectively, where players don't have a, like, you want to give players reasons to not use pieces of equipment just as much as you give them reasons to use it. And this kind of falls into that generically good sort of thing that I was talking about with rings. A lot of that applies to armor as well. So this is where, like, the weight system means that there's not one armor set that everybody's running, right? You're not having people running around in full havels without the consequences of wearing full havels, which for most builds is going to be you can't move very well. So having things like the Grass Crest Shield, what are some other? There's not a ton of them, and this is part of it as well. It's not like you're choosing between useful passive effects. It's the sort of thing where there would be different ways that you can kind of address this from a design standpoint. But they did a few things over the course of it. I feel like Dark Souls 3 has fewer overall armor pieces with weird passive effects on them. Dark Souls 2 had quite a few. It had the Jester set. It had the cat paws shoes thing. Those were kind of weird. You do have the Dusk Crown that buffs sorcery damage across several of the games. Dark Souls 1 and 3 at least. I don't remember off the top of my head if 2 has that as well. 2 has just so many things in it. You have the crowns in Dark Souls 2 that have really potent passive effects. Like, you can do cool stuff by having potent passive effects, but it also, like, means that players are generally going to gravitate towards those equipment that have it. And I don't feel that FromSoft, at least in the Dark Souls trilogy, did a really good job of, like, compensating for that. And like, some of them, like the Dusk Crown, has the limited scope of only being useful for certain builds. But I think the best way of handling something like that is to have, like, different, not exactly set bonuses, but like different ways for, if you're going to have passive effects, have different ways of things kind of contributing to passive effects, but in a, like, capped sort of way. And this might be something that could address rings as well. So what I mean by this, for example, is imagine you have Chloranthy Ring and Grass Crest Shield and Mask of a Child. These all are Dark Souls 1 pieces of equipment that improve stamina regeneration. If it was the sort of thing where you had, say, 4 notches of bonus stamina regeneration that you could get, and maybe Grass Crest Shield gave you 2, Mask of the Child gave you 3, and Chloranthy Ring gave you 3. Suddenly, wearing all of them doesn't, like, exceeds the cap, and so you might as well switch one of them out. So maybe you are going to use, like, the Grass Crest Shield and the Chloranthy Ring, or those aren't, like, perfect numbers. You'd want to massage that, and you might want to have some other pieces of equipment that, like, give you a 1 there. But the sort of thing where you can stack them up to a point, but beyond a point they don't stack. Stuff like that with enough options. Something else that can kind of work is, like, the infusions. So in Dark Souls 3, you can have Blessed Infusion and Simple Infusion give you passive regen on HP and FP, respectively, I think. I said them in the order where that's respectively. And so you can put that on pieces of equipment, even if you're not going to, like, explicitly use that equipment. You could also have that for, like, stamina regen, for example. And if you had the ability to infuse effects on armor like that, that would allow you to be able to kind of change things up as well. So there's different ways that you can kind of try to address that. And FromSoft is, like, sort of dabbled in that area, but not a whole lot. And so having things like the Grass Crest Shield, they had like 2 different shields that had that sort of effect in Dark Souls 2. But having that sort of effect is quite strong, and it means that players tend to gravitate towards those pieces of equipment. And so if you want to kind of like change things up, you want to look at, okay, why would somebody not do this, as well as why would somebody use it? So yeah, going back to enemy design, one of the big things though that you're looking at with enemy design is what sort of things are you making good here? So for example, maybe the best way of dealing with a bunch of archers is to block them. In that case, you have to make it so that way you can move when you get hit by arrows and stuff like that. Like taking hit stun while blocking means that you can't really move. So obviously that makes rolling better. But like there's different ways you can kind of like try to address stuff. So for example, and you can do this through the environment as well. But it's really useful to have a bow in the Anor Londo rafters. That way you can shoot at the painting guardians up in the rafters to get them to come move towards you and stuff. Or having a bow in general to be able to snipe stuff can be really, really useful at times. But you have to kind of position stuff that's how it works. But other examples are, do you want the player to find gear that's good against spellcasters, or to use equipment or consumable items that's good against, like, helps them reduce magic damage? Then you need to introduce enemies that are weak to those things, or that inflict those things, or whatever, which is the same sort of thing. So, like, Crystal Sage, like, there's a reason why they give you an area where you can get a drop of consumable items that reduces the magic damage you take right near that boss battle. So that way you have that sort of option, and it gives you that tool. So there's a lot of different things in that regard that can impact stuff, and I feel that FromSoft generally does a decent job of that. You're also looking at enemy compositions. One of the big things is sort of balancing challenge of enemies. So each enemy can be kind of a different puzzle. For example, you can have the spear and shield hollows that hold up the shield and make the player have to use guard break stuff to be able to fight them effectively, or parry them when they go to attack. This is something that I think is a little bit stronger in terms of that specific type of enemy. Is a little bit stronger in Dark Souls 1, just because the parry action is more reliable. So I don't know about you, but for me, parrying is how I want to fight Silver Knights. That just seems like the best way of trying to fight them. They guard a lot. They're generally holding their guard up, so you can't really attack them effectively, and trying to do so leaves you open. So you can try to circle around them and backstab, but that doesn't necessarily always work super well. And it's not that difficult to learn how to parry them effectively, which is a really good way of killing them. They're overall fairly low health, so that makes it fairly easy to actually one-shot them. It's just they turtle a lot behind their shield. So having that sort of like difference where it's like, oh, the way that I approach this enemy is I wait for it to attack and I counter its attack, means that that's a really useful option and gives you an incentive to learn how to do that, because it makes it easier to actually fight those enemies. There's some amount of this in Dark Souls 3, but guard breaking is easier to do in that game. Like it puts them in a repostable animation, so you can get a critical hit on them, and the kick is more reliable for breaking guards than the Dark Souls 1 kick is, at least enemy guards, in my experience. So you do have like the Shield Lothric Knights, or like the Lothric Knights that like to hide behind their shields, but it's a lot harder to land parries. So, but that's an example of the sort of enemy that you want to have. And so it's good that they have some amount of those enemies that ask you to participate with more systems, because then it makes those systems relevant. There's potentially a little bit more that they could do with some of that, but also looking at different compositions of like, oh, this enemy needs you to approach it in this way, and this enemy wants you to approach it in that way, and like different combinations of that can lead to different things as well. There's a lot of different enemies, and I don't want to go over like each one or anything. I do feel that over the course of the game, over the course of the franchise, they tried to make enemies that could counter common strategies. The biggest example of this are anti-backstab enemies. So you have in Dark Souls 2, you have the turtles that you can't backstab and will do the, I don't know what you want to call it. They'll fall over on their backs to smash you if you hang out behind them. And then you have the Lothric Knights that, and this is really interesting to me. So the Lothric Knights are specifically designed to do a shield bash if you circle around them counterclockwise or anti-clockwise if you prefer. And that means like they observe that players tended to try to circle around enemies that way rather than the other way. You can circle around them the other way, and they don't use the shield bash because they're where their shield is. I don't remember if they have a specific attack for that direction because I always had a tendency to go the other way, so I wasn't looking for that. I think it's really interesting where they have enemies that do that to try to prevent the player from relying on a crutch strategy and make them engage with more systems. I think that's good. You definitely want to make sure that there are enemies that are vulnerable to specific strategies like backstabbing, though, in order to make those useful as well. So it's interesting to sort of see the evolution of enemies from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 2 to Dark Souls 3, where they're trying to look for what strategies do players use, how can we make certain enemies that are specifically good against these. Also, dogs should obey the rules of physics. That's all I'm going to say there. Friggin' teleporting dogs from Dark Souls 3. In general, I think Dark Souls 3 enemy design tends to suffer a little bit, in my opinion, from... I'm just ruminating over enemies here. From... what's the right term for this? I don't have a good summary term. So I feel like there's a lot of enemies that are very overbearing or very relentless in Dark Souls 3 in particular, because that's the one that I played through most recently. So it's kind of sticking out in my mind a little bit more. Dark Souls 1 tends to have enemies that have very clear attack cycles, and then they kind of stop. So you can kind of like find breathing room between them. Dark Souls 3 has a lot more enemies where I feel like and this is a little bit of figure out your spacing better player, where by the time they finish attacking and have a pause, I have to recover my stamina. I can't attack them because I've spent all of my stamina dodging or blocking. And again, this is a spot where it's like, okay, do better, like space better so that we're not having to take active defensive options. And that's definitely, like, there's an argument that that is the approach that I need to take with that sort of thing. But that's something that really kind of stands out to me. And this goes for regular enemies as well as bosses, where part of the difficulty of the later games is figuring out how to avoid the bosses without actively protecting yourself, where you're using positioning and spacing as a defensive tool, and not just dodging and blocking. That definitely makes the games harder and introduces other challenges. I think something that I want to talk about bosses specifically is something that really affects my ability to enjoy bosses is how close bonfires are. If a boss is hard, but the bonfire is close, I enjoy that a lot more than a boss that's maybe a little bit easier, but with a further away bonfire. I know a lot of people will rate the Artorias boss fight very highly. I actually don't like most of the boss fights in the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. And the reason why is that the run back to the boss is just too long. If it's something where I can be reasonably expected to die very easily, very quickly to this boss fight, I want the bonfire to be very close because I want to be able to redo the boss fight more rapidly. And particularly with Manus, Calamite, and Artorias, the runbacks are not hard. They are easy runbacks. And having a difficult boss after a hard path should have an easy boss afterwards, in my opinion, because like you've you've had to go through a really difficult path to get there. So this is a little bit more of a complicated thing. But in general, I prefer having bonfires right by the boss fights, so that way I'm not spending especially if it's like a trivial run back, where it's like, okay, the run back to Artorias means I have to run around some plants, go down an elevator, and then walk into the fog gate. It still takes like a minute or two to do, and if I'm dying in the first 30 seconds because I've like not figured out my timing just yet for dodging, I don't know, the thrust attack or something, then that becomes really frustrating to me. I actually like the Fume Knight fight. Now, I haven't done it in quite some time, but I have very positive memories of Fume Knight fight, which is a very hard fight, but the bonfire for that fight is super close. And so my ability to enjoy a difficult boss fight is very directly connected to how much time do I have to waste getting back to that boss fight. And so this is where I don't enjoy Calamite. I don't enjoy Manus. The only way I've ever killed Manus has been by sniping him from outside his arena with a bow. And that's because, like, learning the fight is enough of a process that the amount of time I have to wait between attempts is just too long, and it just robs me in any enjoyment I have of that fight from it. So that's a big thing for me for a boss fight standpoint. I also, just in general, like, one thing that tends to make me not enjoy a lot of Souls boss fights that much is I feel like they are often too long for what I want, where they can feel really drawn out. But that's another sort of matter. This is especially true with the Elfrida and Father Ariandel fight with its friggin' 3 phases. Like, that thing just drags on and on and on and on. I'm not going to talk about that fight too terribly much here. I do think in general, I don't know. Boss fights are maybe more interesting as you go forward in the series. I don't have a whole lot to say about boss design. There's different things that are going to distract people different ways. I personally don't like the Twin Princes boss fight because I don't like the teleporting in Dark Souls 3, but I can understand where maybe somebody does like something about that fight. I think that the mechanic is really interesting of like, oh, this one keeps resurrecting the other one. I think that's really interesting. And the way that positionality can factor into that fight, where you stand to strike that boss means that you can hit the other prince, the younger prince, on the back of the older one. Is it Lothric on the back of Lorien? I think that's the case. But being able to do that, that's really cool. That sort of arrangement, really neat. I like that. Figuring out how to prioritize between Father Ariandel and Sister Frida in phase 2 of that fight is does have some interest, because like Father Ariandel is a little bit easier to target because he's big and very obvious. But Elfrida, if you ignore her, will heal. I think that fight has a little too much going on, especially if you don't have Gale to help you, because, I don't know, maybe you've gone too far in the Ringed City DLC. But they do generally do a good job of making fights feel rewarding. I generally also personally don't like the big dragon fights. Midir, Calamite, and have I even really tried to fight the Ancient Dragon in Dark Souls 2? Probably not. I don't tend to personally like those fights just because I feel like you spend so much time running around to try to get to the enemy in the first place, and then they're really drawn out. And it's basically all of the things that I don't like about boss fights in one handy package. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I have a whole lot more specifically that I want to say on that. Just noting that they refine the bosses more as they go and introduce more mechanics and things like that. So let's talk about magic. I really like magic. There's a lot to talk about magic because there's a lot of different things going on. So first of all, we have different types of magic. We have sorceries, pyromancies, hexes, and miracles. Hexes, of course, were not introduced until Dark Souls 2. And in 2 and 3, they follow I think they both follow the pattern. I'm trying to remember mechanics here because there's just a lot of being kind of int and faith-based. There's just so many changes. Okay, so Dark Souls 1. Let's just start with Dark Souls 1 and kind of work through them. So Dark Souls 1 has sorceries, pyromancies, and miracles. The thing that's really interesting to me about this is that pyromancies do not rely on a stat. I mean, aside from attunement to be able to equip them. And then you have the attunement slots, and then each copy of the spell that you have has a certain number of charges, which gives you, a certain number of times that you can use it. Brain is running off in different design directions right here. We'll get to that. So this system is trying to sort of mimic certain things. Some spells can use multiple slots, like the Chaos Pyromancies tend to use two. It's kind of a balancing mechanism, and I think that's a useful technique to be able to have. Dark Souls 2 has, I think, attunement can raise the maximum number of charges you get from any given thing as well, which is kind of neat. But hexes basically don't exist. There's just dark versions of stuff. Sorceries. I don't think there was a dark miracle, was there? Because there's Black Flame, and then there's a couple of sorceries: Dark Orb, the Poison Mist one, Dark Fog, and Dark Bead, as well as Pursuers that are all sorceries. Magic is extremely strong in Dark Souls 1 and does not require any stamina to use, so that's also very powerful. And you can stack the Dusk Crown ring, or not, the Dusk Crown hat, not the ring, but the hat, because the ring gives you more charges. The hat and the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring to dramatically improve the amount of damage that you're dealing, so that you can hit really, really hard with magic, and it feels very satisfying to do so. And it also provides a different sort of magic is expensive to use because you need a lot of int and you need attunement slots as well in order to be able to effectively use it. But you don't have to spend resources upgrading your catalyst in Dark Souls 1. So that's an area where you're saving cost. You do have to spend a bunch of money to acquire spells, however. And some of those get quite expensive. So multiple copies of Soul Spear that you'll probably want from Logan and Griggs, Crystal Soul Spear, all of that is going to require a lot of souls to be able to use. So there's a lot of cost associated. Miracles and like Pyromancies are similarly super expensive. There's no scaling with anything. You just have to pump souls into it, and you need to pump a lot to be able to get a fully upgraded Pyromancy Flame, which is the only caster implement that upgrades, now that I think about it. So there's a lot there of upgrading this is a serious investment. But anyone can do it, which is really cool because it means that there's a type of magic that literally anyone can use, and that opens up options for people, which I think is super worthwhile. Faith was... I personally like Faith. I like the lightning spears. I think that's really cool. It's deeply underwhelming basically most of the time. The lightning spears are really strong in Dark Souls 1, but they are so hard to get your hands on because you have to get into the Covenant, the light Warriors of Sunlight Covenant, and then you have to get the which requires a certain amount of co-op or faith, and then you have to get the medals to turn in there in order to be able to upgrade. And anything linked to covenants is kind of a royal pain in the rear end if you're mostly playing offline and not really engaging with the online stuff. So having the major offensive miracles be tied to the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant is kind of frustrating. But anyway, so yeah, there's so many different things here to talk about. There's the paths in which you can travel to get certain spells. So, for example, where do you find more of casting stuff? This can kind of influence the route that you want to take. So, for example, if you're going for sorceries, you really want to go to the lower burg to get to Griggs. If you want to do pyromancy stuff, you really want to get to Laurentius, which means that you need to go through the depths area, or the first part of the depths, which goes through the lower berg. So those are kind of the same path. Faith, you kind of have some stuff off of Petrus, and then you have some stuff later that requires you to kill Capra Demon to send the group down. Dark Souls 2 has some similar like routing stuff where it's like, okay, which directions are you going to get these NPCs to teach you stuff and upgrade your equipment? Dark Souls 3 is just a much more linear game in general. Irina's available very early, but is mostly defensive stuff, like healing, until you get a little bit later. One of the other things that's a little annoying is that a lot of the faith heals are very hard to use in combat. I understand that there's a balancing mechanism here because they have Estus. But there's just so much to talk about with magic. So yeah, a lot of stuff very strong early on in the games. Dark Souls 2 has a lot going on. So you finally really get access to boss spells, which is cool. There's some stuff that you find out in the world. Somebody pointed out, like, getting Great Soul Arrow in the Forest of Fallen Giants, for example. Everything basically can be upgraded. I remember also infusing my spellcasting catalysts to try to make them better for certain things, because they scaled with the like lightning damage of those and stuff, as an example. There's also the spices, which is a really interesting mechanic from Dark Souls 2 only to lower the requirements of spells. I think this is really neat because this kind of, like, they introduced pyromancy really needing you to get stats in order to be able to use. Now, Dark Souls 2 makes it a lot easier to use magic in the sense that levels are just a lot easier to acquire. And so that's a nice benefit. Of course, there's also like weapons that you're upgrading to kind of line up with these. So your int weapons and your faith weapons and stuff, in terms of upgrade paths. But yeah, so this was kind of a neat idea, the spices. Simpleton Spice and Skeptic Spice that let you lower the int and faith requirements of magic. You still have attunement slots, of course, but you have the ability to recover casts now with the old spice and stuff, like similar to the FP recovery items from Demon Souls. But so you have those. You also have access to the Rouge water and the Crimson water. Rouge means red. Rogue is a different thing. Those words are often conflated with each other. So yeah. Oh, there's just so many things to talk about. Okay. But this finally introduced hexes as their own thing, kind of, but hexes scale with faith and int and use both sorcery, wands, and bells, I guess it was, from that are associated with miracles. So there's kind of like, it's kind of a weird sort of area. The big thing with spells in Dark Souls 2 is they started off really good, but then they kept getting nerfed to the point where it's just like it didn't feel worth it to use magic a whole lot anymore. Part of what happened was the response to people getting invaded, which is understandable. There were like it's this skill-based difficulty where new players aren't good at dodging magic and experienced players are. And if you balance it for new players, magic needs to be relatively weak because landing hits is easy. But against experienced players, magic needs to be relatively strong because landing hits is hard. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of balance there. Also, how much mobility you have while casting is notable. Cast times is a notable thing. yes, because spells have different costs. They have FP in 3. They have copies. Dark Souls 1 and 2. One of the things that I really liked that Dark Souls 2 introduced was weapons that can cast magic. Dark Souls 1 didn't have this. 2 introduced weapons that could function as like the blue sword that could cast sorceries, or the mace that could cast miracles. Those were really cool. Of course, they had the problem of being a bit weaker than if you had a dedicated casting implement, which is kind of an okay balancing mechanic. Dark Souls 3 also kind of continued this to an extent. I really wish they had had a few more things that could cast miracles in terms of weapons, because it's just the Father Ariandel's whip, hammer, flail thing from the DLC. There are several implements that can cast other things, though. One of the things I thought was really cool that they introduced in 3 is caster implements that could cast multiple types. So you have the crystal chime that could cast miracles and sorceries. That's really cool. You have did they have one for, I know that they have the I forget what they called it, but basically the like hair from the Fair Lady that can cast miracles and pyromancies, which is really neat, if a bit underwhelming in terms of raw power. And then there's, I don't know that they had a sorcery pyromancy one. I can't think of one offhand. I know that they had the one demon's like fire sword from the Ring City DLC that could cast pyromancies. So those sorts of things are really cool. I like having those. And that's something that they added that I think was really neat. I do wish that they had a few more things along those lines. There are, of course, cast multiple types. There are, of course, things with special properties like the Tin Crystallization Catalyst that give you more power at the cost of use. And that's something that they also introduced or continued on into Dark Souls 3. One of the big differences between Dark Souls 1 and 2 and then 3 is the introduction of FP. I do feel that magic is in a better spot in Dark Souls 3 in terms of actual power and damage that it deals than where it ended up in 2. But it's very difficult for them to kind of balance, because magic kind of sidesteps a lot of the other things. They introduced in 2 and kept in 3 the fact that magic now costs stamina to use, by the by, which I absolutely should mention. It's just keeping track of everything is difficult, even with stuff here. Just because there's so many things that changed with magic over time. So Dark Souls 3, I'm particularly thinking of. Dark Souls 3 has, first of all, it's very expensive, again, to use magic from a build standpoint, again, in 3. And I don't feel like the payoff is quite as commensurate as it is in 1, because you need attunement for attunement slots and FP to be able to use them. And then you need the attribute that you're actually casting off of. And because it requires endurance to cast magic, you also kind of want more stamina in a way that you didn't need as much in Dark Souls 1. Like in Dark Souls 1, you kind of skimp on stamina in order to be able to cast spells, because your spells didn't cost stamina to use. So you could reserve it for like rolling and blocking and running. But because it starts costing stamina to use spells in 2 and 3, you kind of definitely want your stamina more, and you can't like skimp on it as much. Magic is also a limited resource in a way that weapons aren't. So one of the challenges in 3 is that you don't have... So 3 makes magic more expensive to use in the standpoint of needing FP to restore that takes away from your ability to heal your health. Because your Ashen Estus you balance your resource between Ashen Estus and regular HP healing Estus. And the fact that you're kind of like balancing between the two means that if you want to be able to heal your HP, you have less ability to restore your FP that you use to cast spells, and vice versa. Like it goes both ways, and that's really difficult and awkward. And And so magic is definitely at its like most costly to use in 3 because it takes like a bunch of additional resources to be able to use in terms of attunement that you can skip out on if you're not doing it, as well as like you're probably going to need a weapon, so you're going to need stats to be able to meet the minimum requirements for a weapon, which you can absolutely do. Like there's weapons that are reasonable to do that way. But you also then need a bunch of points in the to be able to get your spells. And then like it feels like they kind of try to design magic to be a little bit more spammable. Like lightning spears are a lot faster to cast in 3 than they are in 1, but Dark Souls 1 lightning spears deal way more damage. So it feels that they were reducing the damage and making it something where you try to fling it more, but you don't want to do it in somebody's face, so you kind of are trying to keep your distance. It's an entirely different thing. So the thing that I had the like thought on earlier is getting multiple copies of spells is not meaningful in Dark Souls 3, where it is in 1 and 2. So 1 and 2, getting more copies gives you more charges to use. It lets you use the spell more. Dark Souls 3, because spells cost FP, that's not a thing. It would have been interesting if you could stack multiple copies of the same one to increase power. So like if you got multiple copies of heal, assigning multiple copies of heal, if that would allow it to be a more potent version of heal. Something like that would be a really interesting mechanic to use. But is a little bit different than like it's a question of how much are they trying to change things between games versus how much are they trying to maintain the feel of Dark Souls by having recurring elements. And that's one of the things that's a big challenge as they kind of go through the games. So, but yeah, there's a lot of changes. I feel that magic is a bit too restrictive in 3, because here's one of the things with magic in Dark Souls 1 and 2 is because it's individual charges to spells, using any individual spell does not take away from your ability to use other spells, whereas FP means that using a spell takes away from your ability to use other spells, which means that you don't really want to equip as many spells because it's like, okay, well, here's the main spell that I'm using, and anything else is kind of like there's not a reason to use other ones because it's taking away from your ability to use your main spell. So that's really a big difference and has a huge impact on how you're approaching using magic. While I do overall like the FP system better, giving it some sort of passive regen or giving something kind of going on, like making you have to choose between being able to heal your HP and restore your MP or your FP or whatever we're calling it here. It's a big impact on viability, as it were. So, I don't know. I feel like I've just spent a lot of words to basically say I feel like magic has been something that FromSoft has really struggled to find a sweet spot for. I'm hoping that Elden Ring does a better job of that. We'll see. And the actual like charge-based system, like the cast system that they used in 1 and 2, actually was a lot stronger for magic than the FP in 3. And I think there's a lot of things that they could do to make magic feel better. So here's one of the things that's a real challenge is how do you design magic that's useful to have as kind of like a utility slot that doesn't then just become really powerful when you specialize in it too much? And this is where I think having some spells that are kind of more static in strength, that don't scale as much with like magic adjust or whatever we're using, is probably nice to have as some options that have relatively low to no requirements. This is also where we run into weird stuff with like Velka's Talisman. Velka's Talisman is a Dark Souls 1 talisman, so it's for casting miracles, but its magic adjust scales with int, not faith. However, you still need the faith requirement in order to be able to cast miracles. So if you want to use Wrath of the Gods, you still need the 28 or 30 faith or whatever exactly it is in Dark Souls 1 in order to be able to do that. You can't just do it off of the talisman and having 30 int. So you need to meet the faith requirement, and then you can go higher in the other one, but and they have an equivalent sort of thing for casting sorceries with faith. But the problem is needing to meet the requirement. And this is where something like the spices could be really interesting. Where if you're like, oh, I want to be able to use Velka's talisman to do a really good job with casting Sunlight Spear, but I don't want to have to get up to the 40 or 50 faith required to be able to do that. If you could lower it somehow and invest a bunch of resources somehow to lower that requirement to the point where you could use it without having to have an absurd amount of faith, that basically means why are you bothering to use this int-based casting implement? You see what I'm saying? Hopefully. Like some of those things are like, this is an interesting idea, but it doesn't actually practically work in the system. I don't know. I want magic to feel good. I want it to feel effective and useful, but I also recognize it needs to not overshadow physical weapons, and finding the sweet spot for that has proven to be really challenging. Making magic that you want to use with like low investment as a supplement to a primarily physical build is also something that I feel they have struggled with to an extent. Particularly because a lot of the spell buffs scale with your magic stat. So like Sunlight Blade or Crystal Weapon or whatever scale with your Faith and Int respectively most of the time. So it makes you not want to... And like they usually have fairly hefty requirements anyway. So it's the sort of thing where it's like, oh, magic weapon at like a 10 int requirement, if that just added a flat bonus that was worth using, then that sort of thing becomes useful utility where maybe you want to dabble in a little bit of magic. Or like Fair and Dart, for example, in Dark Souls 3, like if we go to, where is spells? Sorceries. And then wait for this to load. So Fair and Dart is a fairly weak... Man, Crystal Hail is such an underwhelming... So many of these spells are super underwhelming as part of it. But Fair and Dart is... Like, the idea is that this is a low int, low FP using spell. It only uses 3 FP. It costs a slot. And it only requires 8 int. Like, okay, that seems pretty good. But it deals very little damage. As you can see, its magic damage equals approximately the spell buff of your catalyst times basically half. This makes it really, really hard to actually use effectively because the damage is super, super low. So, like, you're having to wait for the cast time and everything, and it's just like, I'm not going to use this as a physical attacker. I'm barely going to want to use this as a spell caster because the damage is so low. It's not worth the 3 FP, and it's especially not worth the slot. And that's the big issue. Like, I think Dark Souls 3 would have been better off giving you way more slots and having things cost multiple. But, like, I want this to be something where I'm like, oh, yeah, I kind of want to use this on a warrior because it's magic damage. What if its magic damage was more or less static? Where it's like, oh, maybe if you have a lot of int, it deals like 8% more damage or something, but mostly it's kind of like in a set spot, then that's something that I can start using. Because, like, basically what I'm saying is I want magic that feels like it can be a nice supplement to a primarily physical build that has low requirements to use and has, like, more of a constant damage amount. And this is where, like, you can do things with catalysts, like the Ulasil Ivory catalyst having a like static 160 mag adjust or whatever it is. Like, you can do stuff with that, but it's like figuring out, okay, where do I put this in a spot where it's useful to still use, but maybe I'm not heavily invested in this. I'm just like dabbling in it a little bit. I don't know. It's just one of those things I'm thinking about a little. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to character mechanics. The good news is I don't think this is going to be quite as long as I feared it might be, but it's still going to be quite long. So character mechanics there's a lot of similarities going across them. So you can see here on the list, the things I'm talking about are stats and leveling, hollowing, embered, which are two sides of the same coin to some extent. The bottomless box gets mentioned, and covenants. Let's just go ahead and quickly touch on the bottomless box, just to get it out of the way. Dark Souls 2 and 3 have a just right off the bat, you have access to your storage, and Dark Souls 1, you have to buy the bottomless box. I think it's better to just start you off with the bottomless box. It makes it a lot easier to keep track of your inventory by clearing stuff out. Particularly since the games like to give you lots of pieces of equipment, and you're definitely not going to need to sort through all of it, but maybe you want to hang it or like keep it around. So just from an inventory management standpoint, requiring you to buy the bottomless box seems a little weird. So I think that's a good improvement that Dark Souls 2 introduced and Dark Souls 3 kept, of just keeping those things. So stats and leveling. There's a bunch of different stats. They changed them up across the games. So Dark Souls 2 introduced adaptability. Dark Souls 3 got rid of it. That was the right move. Resistance is also something that got dropped. I think that's reasonable. Everybody kind of saw resistance as not particularly useful. There might be more use to it than we thought, but I haven't spent any time experimenting with it. One of the big things that they did was going from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 2 that 3 kept is splitting. So in Dark Souls 1, endurance dictates... Did they call it endurance? Yeah, because it dictates both your maximum stamina and your equip burden. They ended up splitting that into... And then they rebranded Vitality as Vigor, and then made Vitality equipment burden, and endurance stayed on stamina, so they kind of split those off. I can see why they did that, because having more maximum stamina is really good. And having Dark Souls, like in Dark Souls 1, there's endurance is a really good stat to invest in because having more equipment load. But the thing is, like, introducing the smoother scaling on rolls and everything, and the 70% threshold and everything, means that you don't need equipment burden as much in 2 and 3. So really choosing to specialize in it is its own thing. There's a lot of different stats is what I'm saying. I personally prefer the leveling rate of 2, and I feel that 1 and 3 feel a bit tighter. I think 3 feels the worst in this regard because 3 has the most sort of like valid stats that you kind of want to go into. So if we look at stats here in Dark Souls 3, yeah, we have Vigor, Attunement, Endurance, Vitality, Strength, Dexterity, and Faith, and Luck. Luck is an interesting one in that it's hard to want to spend a bunch of points in it because it feels a bit more secondary. It does say it controls weapon damage. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Let's look at luck. So increases damage on equipment with luck scaling. Yeah, and increases item discovery. Like, there's a lot of benefit to getting some luck in terms of having better drop rates, and there's specific equipment that kind of works with it and stuff, and that's interesting. But yeah, it's a bunch of different stats. There's different reasons why you want to kind of go into each of them. So it feels more stretched with stats. It's kind of what I'm saying. Dark Souls 1 is much tighter on stats. Like, there's just fewer... Do they have it? Well, humanity and soul level are slightly different things. So you have vitality, which is for your HP, attunement, endurance, strength, dexterity, resistance, which everybody ignored, intelligence, and faith. So this is a lot more streamlined. It's a lot tighter. So the decreased number of stats that you're kind of... Or like the higher price of levels compared to 2 doesn't feel as bad. Or it doesn't feel as restrictive just because you don't have as many things as you're kind of going towards. So that has a huge impact on things. 2 has a lot of stats, and it does things way more wonkily, where I think the system's interesting, but going into here, so they made Vigor for increasing maximum HP. Then you have Endurance, which increases a bunch of different things. Vitality increases a bunch of different things. So you can see here, let me zoom this in more. Maybe not quite that much. So like endurance is affecting physical defense and vitality is affecting physical defense because you have these different things. You have attunement, which affects attunement slots, but also gives you extra casts and affects agility, and like everything gives you a slight amount of HP, and strength gives you physical defense, and dexterity gives you poison attack bonus. It gives you some physical defense, and adaptability gives you agility and a bunch of other stuff. And like you have a lot more stats going on here with a lot more stuff going on, and well, maybe not a lot more stats, but it's a lot more indirect, and it's a very wonky system. With a lot more things kind of filtering into stuff. It's like faith gives you fire bonus. There, I'm zooming that out a little bit so it's not quite as heavily stacked. But it gives you like fire bonus and lightning attack bonus and dark attack, but kind of wonky, and it's just got a lot more, like, it's got this weird interaction system, which I personally think is kind of interesting and neat, but also like a lot to kind of juggle. So it's a lot more direct with Dark Souls 3, but it definitely feels a lot tighter. So it's interesting to kind of see them take some things and move some stuff around and play around with stats a little bit. I definitely think adaptability, or more accurately agility, was a mistake, because agility affects action speed as well as iframes on your roll. And so low agility makes the game play worse and less reliable, and that's something you're going to have early on. So that just overall makes the game not feel as good, because you have fewer iframes, which means that your dodges feel a lot less reliable. You have, which actually that brings me to a point that I should mention actually, with dodge rolls specifically. One of the things with Dark Souls 2 that makes combat not feel as good as some of the other ones is that it does a worse job of telegraphing activeness of hitboxes, as well as having some animation stuff. So I had a thread with some people on Twitter talking about the way dodge, like just wondering about, do we have the ability to visualize collision information with Dark Souls 2? Because it was feeling to me an awful lot like dodge rolls were like not activating, or like didn't move your character as much. Like it seemed like your character, this is something that I kind of hypothesized, I have revisions to this, but where it felt like you would do the dodge roll, but it wouldn't update your character's position until you kind of finished it. And what actually seems to be happening is that, first of all, there seems to be some sort of like animation system in place such that when you actually are hit by, especially grabs, although this affects backstabs as well, when you're actually hit by those, it kind of waits for your dodge animation to finish before it plays the you got hit animation, which then snaps you into position. Combined with low agility, this feels really bad because your ability to like be out of the way from hit frames feels really bad. But the other thing is the active frames on attacks is often more than it seems like it should be. So what I mean by this is, like, for example, using a pen as a model here that you can't really see. Using this black comb, which will stand out against my hand a bit better, as an example, the Pursuer has that like stab attack where its grab glows blue. That is active throughout the entire attack animation when it doesn't look like it should be. So there's a lot of times where I think there's active frames on attacks that, like, it's being active when it's not being telegraphed as active in the way that we expect it to through things like move speed. It feels like it's in wind-up frames, not active frames, or it feels like it's in lag frames, like after the attack, not active frames. So you get kind of this effect where the attack actually crosses your character model, but it waits until the attack's animation has hit its like active-ish, like most active point, and then it like snaps your character to it, and that's where things start feeling really bad. So there's a lot of points where I think the animations are not appropriately telegraphing activeness, and I think that's kind of what makes things feel bad, combined with agility making you have significantly fewer iframes than you would expect, which makes your rolls feel a lot less reliable. So there's, I think, a lot of stuff kind of stacking together that kind of affects things. Okay, so I think I've talked about stats enough and how those have kind of changed. Let's talk about hollowing / embered. So this is something that changes a lot over the course of the franchise. Dark Souls 1 has the hollowed and unhollowed normal states. The only difference between them is whether or not you can summon, be invaded, and how much you look like jerky. So, and your ability to kindle. So most of the time, the main incentives for reversing hollowing in Dark Souls 1 are because you want to summon somebody or because you want to kindle a bonfire. And if you're playing offline, I mean, summon NPCs or kindle bonfires, or not look like jerky. But, armor can help with that because you can hide your jerkiness. So that's, a system. Dark Souls 2 has the whole curse thing where dying or getting cursed will lower your maximum HP by a little bit, and it caps at like 50% unless you have a lot of sin, in which case it caps lower, and there's a whole lot of complicated stuff there. But you lose HP, which is very similar to what Demon Souls did, where death would have your HP, except this was more gradual. So it's more forgiving than that, but it's more punishing than Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 3 does a different thing, where you have the embered state, which increases your maximum HP, and your unembered state, which has a lower base HP. This is a really clever bit of HP bar telegraphing, because it's the same sort of mechanic as Dark Souls 2 has, except it's more like Demon Souls because it's binary on or off rather than a gradual progression. Where being embered is a higher HP state, and you have less HP for being hollowed, or unembered, technically, because hollowing is a different mechanic entirely in Dark Souls 3 that makes you look like beef jerky again and accumulates hollowing, but it has no effect on your HP, just like it has no effect on your HP in Dark Souls 1. So that's interesting, but it's kind of a side system. So Dark Souls 3's presentation of increased HP rather than decreased HP probably feels better to a lot of people because it's presenting it the opposite way. Dark Souls 2 presents death as decreasing your maximum HP, whereas Dark Souls 3 presents embering as increasing your maximum HP. These are mechanically the same sort of thing, but because the presentation differs, i.e., one shows you your health bar shrinking and the other shows you with a bigger health bar and more health, but doesn't show you like, oh, being unembered puts you at 2/3 HP or whatever it actually is. I'm sure that they have it available here on the wiki to look up. Let's click on HP and see if this tells us. So Ember plus 30% until death. Okay, so being embered gives you plus 30% HP, so it's a third benefit. Oh, interesting. I didn't know Siegbrow healed based upon percentage of maximum HP. That's cool to know. At any rate, yeah, and then they scale with your spell buff for the healing spells. I'm getting distracted though. So because of that presentation difference, it disguises the mechanic, which I think is really interesting, and a neat way of trying to approach that, because it feels better to say you entered a state and got a bonus than to say that you got punished for something, right? It feels like a reward, and therefore it feels better. So I think that's really an interesting sort of difference. Obviously, the Dark Souls 1 one, where you're not punished on death by losing maximum HP, is the most forgiving. This is part of where, like, Dark Souls 3 is actually the most punishing Souls game, because losing your Embered status decreases your maximum HP by a larger factor than Dark Souls 2, and your healing items are much more restricted in Dark Souls 3, because you can't just pop embers to fully heal yourself. You have much more limited supply of healing items and stuff in general. So I think this is just a really interesting thing where they shifted how they were doing this thing over the course of the games. And I have no particular like thoughts of like, oh, this is better or worse or anything like that. I just think it's interesting how it changed and how they approached it differently, and in particular how they presented it differently, especially between 2 and 3 hollowing versus Embered status. And then we have covenants. So this is something that also changes pretty dramatically. Dark Souls 1 presents a punishment for leaving covenants, potential angering of them. Dark Souls 2 and 1, though, you have to go to specific locations in order to change your covenant, whereas Dark Souls 3 gives you an equipable item. I think Dark Souls 3's method is a lot more streamlined. I like the feeling of commitment that you get with 1 and 2. Probably my biggest complaint about covenants is that I want them to have more feeling of value when playing offline. I like the idea that, oh, I'm aligning myself with this covenant, and that means something. And it adds some nice flavor to the online components. But I tend to prefer playing offline and avoiding having to deal with invaders and stuff. And in particular, because I play on PC, avoiding hackers that can do wonky stuff to your game and or PC. As checks notes, time of recording, all of the PC servers for the Dark Souls franchise are down because they've taken them offline because of a remote coda execution exploit. Hopefully, FromSoft/Namco Bandai are doing something about that. That will be a long-term fix, so we don't have to rely on third-party software and mods such as the various like Blue Sentinels mod and stuff like that. I think some of the PvP things are interesting in theory. Some of the PvP-oriented covenants have a lot of interesting ideas, but I've enjoyed the PvP and stuff in the games, particularly Dark Souls 2. But in general, I've tried to avoid that in by and large to avoid people doing crazy hacking things. So I like the idea of covenants, but I feel that they've been weak in the sense that I wish that they had more single-player value. I think that it would be really neat to have more single-player value. And they also... They've kind of designed them to be a fairly ancillary. So what I mean by this is, this goes back to some of the world design stuff that I talked about, like the Cat Covenant in Dark Souls 1, or the Rat Covenant / Bell Keeper Covenant in Dark Souls 2. Like, there's just not reasons to move through those sorts of areas repeatedly. I don't know. I like the idea of the system. It feels a bit shallow across all of them, and I kind of wish it was more fleshed out. And I feel like there's stuff with world design that could help with some of that, because that also applies to the Wolf Covenant in Dark Souls 3. You know, the ones where it's like, we're guarding this particular territory, covenants that are across all of them. Like, make me have reasons to keep going through that area so I am having to interact with that mechanic more. There's a couple of them in Dark Souls 3 now that I'm thinking about it, because there's Aldrich's Faithful, there's the wolf in the swamp. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, they make them a lot more user-friendly as you go. I think that's a good change personally. It definitely is a change. I just wish that they gave them more offline utility, and like, you can level them offline, but it's a massive grind, and I understand that's to make it so that way people can't just like easily sidestep. Like, they want to make doing the online play the more efficient way of leveling up the covenants because of where they want to place incentives, and that makes perfect sense to me. I just wish some of the Covenants felt that they had more offline use. They do have some in Dark Souls 2, notably the Champions Covenant, Challengers Covenant, the one in Majula that makes enemies not despawn, which that was an interesting mechanic that they got rid of, and I think that's probably for the best overall, but I don't want to dwell on that too much. Like that one is specifically more of a PvE single player Covenant. I would like more of the Covenants to feel that they had offline utility. Finally, NPCs and NPC quests. So there's a bit here to talk about. Obviously, I was starting to try to write scripts for things, and I didn't really get to that much. That's fine. This has been what it has been. So we have a couple of NPCs that I'm highlighting here. Dark Souls 1 NPCs, I personally find the most interesting. And the reason why is because, I skipped over scrolls and stuff in Magic. I was just seeing the NPCs there. We can talk about them when we talk about the Magic NPCs with acquisition tomes/scrolls. We'll talk about that when we talk about Magic trainers. Having the NPCs kind of move in and out is interesting to me. Having merchants and stuff in specific locations that you want to go back to is more interesting to me. The fact that everybody kind of congregates in Majula / Dark Souls 3 Firelink Shrine, in terms of like merchants, is, I mean, it is what it is, but it's convenient on the one hand. On the other hand, I personally liked Dark Souls 1's like NPCs going in and out of the area and not always being in the same area. So this is a big difference between Dark Souls 1 and then 2 and 3 that's kind of been building through all of these, is that Dark Souls 1 is designed in a way that it's a lot more wandering, a lot more exploratory, and a lot more like getting lost. Dark Souls 2 and 3 give you a home base. They give you a reason to go back to that home base, and they don't give you a reason to go to other areas as much. Like there's some farming that you might want to do. There's a little bit of going back to certain areas for specific things or side paths that open up or whatever. But for the most part, Dark Souls 2 and 3 say anything that's super relevant, we're going to, in terms of like NPCs and stuff, we're going to put back in the main area. Fast travel means that you kind of have that like safe haven of Majula / Firelink Shrine. Dark Souls 1, while Firelink Shrine and that is a hub and a central area, they've done so in part because of some NPCs, like Frampt being there, Anastasia being there, but it's not like super important. It's more that it's a crossroads, right? Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 1 is a highly relevant location because of a handful of NPCs that show up there briefly. Griggs and Logan go there and then leave. Laurentius will be there, but he's not the only pyromancy teacher, and he eventually leaves or can leave. It's not a static location. Like people show up there and then they leave, and it's a crossroads in that it leads you to the catacombs. It takes you to the Undead Burg, and then to the Undead Parish, and then down to New Londo Ruins. Like which can take you to a bunch of different places as well. Like it is a crossroads that a bunch of things travel through, and it feels like that. People come and go, and that like more active nature means that the game just feels fundamentally different. And the fact that NPCs congregate like in Majula and in Dark Souls 3's Firelink Shrine reduces some of that wandering. And the fact that you have fast travel to get back there also affects that. The fact that your bonfire can't do as much in 2 and 3 affects that. And I prefer the wandering feel of Dark Souls 1. I prefer the feeling of going to different places. I like not having a home base and where I'm kind of like setting up. Like the bonfire feels like home rather than the specific location. Like bonfires just feel a lot less meaningful to me in 2 and 3 because they're not the spot where I level. They don't carry the same sort of weight. So Emerald Herald and Firekeeper they do some interesting stuff with those NPCs, but they're following in the line of the Maiden in Black, and then the doll as well from Bloodborne. I don't have a strong opinion on them. I prefer mechanically what happens when they don't exist, is kind of what it comes down to. There's different NPC quests. So in general, I prefer the Dark Souls 3 NPC quests. They feel the most robust. The Dark Souls 1's NPC quests feel a bit tricky to actually execute successfully. Solaire's, I mean, depends upon what success is, but Solaire's saving him from just like finding the sun with the maggot requires some heavy investment and stuff. It's in terms of giving humanity to the Fair Lady. That one's pretty obtuse. Siegmeyer is, I still struggle with figuring out how to do that quest correctly to get him all the way through it. Like that one's just really convoluted. Those are the main NPC quests. Like there's definitely other NPCs that show up. And then Dark Souls 2, Lucatiel, I recall being relatively straightforward to do to an extent, but like having to summon her and keep her alive, and then Jugo, like he's got an interesting story going on, but I feel like it doesn't have great payoff. Like he gives you his sword, but his sword's medium. He's kind of a neat fellow, but that one's also one that's kind of feels it's easy to kind of get messed up on. Then there's Dark Souls 3s are definitely a lot more like reliable. And also one of the things that I really like about Dark Souls 3 is there's just a lot more interaction between NPCs on the quests, because you have is it Seekward? I'm getting confused with my onion bros here. Did I pass him? Yeah, Seekward of Katarina. Yeah, so Seekward of Katarina like has interactions with but Dark Souls 2 has the interesting thing with Pate and Crichton, but that's not like super involved, but it is an interesting one. But yeah, you have the interaction between Seekward, Unbreakable Patches, and what's his face? Grey Rat. Like Grey Rat interacts with both Unbreakable Patches, or Unbreakable Patches interacts with both Seekward and Grey Rat, which I think is really interesting. I feel that Hawkwood's chain is really interesting versus like Crestfallen does something and then Salden doesn't really do much, as I recall. I know there's a lot of different like minor NPC things that happen that is hard to keep track of. So they definitely like iterated on the idea of what some of these NPC quests are over time and how involved they should be and what sort of things that they do. And I think that's interesting. Let's talk about, I don't know what to call them, inventory expansion items. Because this is something that they introduced with Dark Souls 3, which I think is a really interesting system. So in Dark Souls 1 and 2, if you like, you need to find new NPCs that have new inventories. So, for example, and sometimes they'd expand them. So you had Mullen and why am I blanking on Aishwame? Domhnall of Xena. That would expand their inventories to include boss armors, which, you know, I appreciate. But for the most part, it was and the Handmaiden takes on that role in Dark Souls 3. I don't know, Dark Souls 3 just feels more pat somehow and more streamlined in a way that I kind of don't like as much. We'll do a conclusion. So, with Dark Souls 1 and 2, like if you're going to find an NPC that sells more stuff, you need to find an NPC that sells more stuff. Dark Souls 3 streamlines this into ashes that you bring to the handmaiden to increase her wares. Does anybody sell you? Yeah, there's a few NPCs that sell you random items, but like if they sell you random items, you can always and they die, you can always take their ashes to the handmaiden to like regain their inventory. So like Grey Rat, he increases inventory through his quest, but then you can eventually bring his ashes to the handmaiden. And like you have the Pyromancy scrolls and the Braille tomes for miracles and the sorcery scrolls with Orbeck, which expand their inventory. So rather than finding stuff out in the world or finding a new NPC that teaches you stuff, you find things that you bring to old NPCs to teach you stuff. It's an interesting system, but it's part of what makes Dark Souls 3 feel more streamlined. So we'll kind of get to that. I touched some on magic trainers. They definitely made magic trainers in Dark Souls 1 a lot more, like, I don't know. Do I have a whole lot to say about them? They definitely vary a lot more. I feel like Dark Souls 2, it's just like, okay, these people kind of like show up in there in specific locations. I don't know that I have a lot to say about that. Let's talk about crows instead. So the crow mechanic in Dark Souls 1 and 3 is very different from the one in Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 1 and 3, they do exchanges with specific items. I like the way that the magic trainers in Dark Souls 1 move on with their lives and have things change about them over time. It makes them feel more active and less static like just merchants as they feel in 2. And 3 has some amount of them moving on as well, but Orbeck I know goes to a different place and stuff. I don't know. Irina can go kind of crazy, or she can kind of become a firekeeper herself. I think that's really cool. So they did some interesting stuff with them there. But yeah, so the crow trading is a really... it's interesting to me that they did a very different thing in 2. So 2 basically is a gacha system, GACHA, where you have tokens that you can enter in for random rolls on stuff. I actually prefer the Dark Souls 2 style of crows better than 1 or 3. And there's a couple of reasons why. One of the big ones is that the 1 and 3 crows are just a pain in the butt to remember what things you can trade to them. So they have useful stuff that you can get, Titanites and various things like that. But you have to remember what specific things to trade to them. And or you have to look it up. It's just a lot. It's interesting. At least one of the things I'm grateful for is that they streamlined the process of trading over the course of the games. Because in Dark Souls 1, you had to trade, or you had to leave the item, and then you had to reload the zone, either by saving and quitting the game and then reloading it, or by going somewhere other than Firelink Shrine and coming back, or by dying, which was very tedious. Dark Souls 2 made it so that way you could just leave the item and they instantly traded, and Dark Souls 3 kept that, which was really good. Dark Souls 3 has a very different set of things. I like that they use the crows in Dark Souls 3 for giving you access to stuff that otherwise doesn't necessarily make sense to put in the world. And that, I think, was a really good use of the crows. Dark Souls 2's like random lottery system I thought was a bit more enjoyable to use for me. It's clear and easy to remember what items you use with the crows. You can get useful stuff. And because there's a random element there, it can lead you down different paths depending upon what you might get early. So like if you chose petrified something as your starting gift and you gave it to the crows right away, you could end up with something on that particular table, which maybe would be good to look at. Let's see. Where do they have the crows? Would they put them under merchants? I feel like there's an argument for putting them under merchants. They did not. Sweet Shell Core. Dark Souls 2 just does things so interestingly. Others. Yeah, Sparkling Sisters is Dinah and Tilo. Oh, you can give them prism stones as well. Fun. Not a whole lot of great stuff from that, but yeah, you have this whole list of things that you can get from the smooth, small, smooth, and silky stone. So you can get some useful stuff. So you could like get a bolt stone early. Maybe that would incline you towards going a certain way, or wow, you can get some good stuff from that potentially. It's a narrower list, so there's less chaff in the smooth return. But you could end up with like a Channeler's Trident, or yeah, like probably Channeler's Trident or Demon's Great Hammer. But you can get some smooth and silky stones early on, so you could potentially get like a Faint Stone or a Bolt Stone, and that might, direct how you want to do that playthrough. So there's like an element there that can potentially be a little bit interesting. And then there's just some useful stuff that you can get. So I don't know. I like the fact that it's repeatable, and I like the fact that it's a lot more straightforward. But that's kind of up to you. I'm definitely glad that they kind of changed how some of that worked, though. Okay, so let's just go ahead and transition into a conclusion to try to bring this thing to a close. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 changed a lot of stuff each time. And there's a lot of things like my ideal Dark Souls game sits somewhere in between all of them. I like overall the Dark Souls 3 combat mechanics the best. I like the feel. Now, I like the Dark Souls 1 parry timings better, but Dark Souls 1 and 3 use basically the same sort of like parry feel. And I like that system better than what 2 does, although I like 2's backstab feel better, with a lot of the unique animations there being really cool, particularly the spear one. The spear backstab is really good. The more wandery nature of Dark Souls 1, particularly pre-Lord Vessel, is to me way more interesting, and I like that interconnective world. Dark Souls 1 definitely has a lot of rough edges in it, and there's definitely a lot of areas that could be a lot smoother and a lot like one of the things that they did with the remaster is the ability to use multiple items at once rather than having to mash through them. That's a huge improvement that they did in terms of quality of life stuff. I like Dark Souls 3's handling of covenants. I like a lot of its build stuff better, but I prefer Dark Souls 2's sort of rate of leveling. I love Majula, but I kind of prefer not having a hub. I like a lot of the aesthetic, actually, of Dark Souls 2 overall, and I've talked about that previously. Yeah, so there's just a lot of different things that kind of fit in between them that I like. So, Dark Souls 3 to me, unfortunately, there's a lot that I dislike strongly about it. I dislike how restrictive it is in terms of giving you Titanite. I dislike, in particular, the way that they handled stuff with slabs and making slabs required for every upgrade path. At the same time, I like the way that it introduces or removes the need for upgrading armor. Like, that to me is a big benefit. Overall, one of the things that I find that I really like in games is and I'm not sure the best way to kind of describe this. I like a certain lack of polish, I guess, for lack of a better word. A certain lack of refinement, a certain roughness. I've called this frayed edges before in some regards. There's a couple of different ways that you can kind of interpret this. Basically, there's a certain amount of design that feels too designy, for lack of a better word, too refined, too gamey, that Dark Souls 3 in particular has. Dark Souls 1 in particular, and 2 to an extent as well, have a sense of you don't quite, especially when you're first playing it, you don't quite know what's there. This is something I talked about a lot with Guild Wars 1 when I did my thorough analytical playthrough of that on stream. Maybe I should do those for the Dark Souls trilogy. Future project. But one of the things that I really like is where it feels like I don't quite know what the possibilities are, what the possibility space is. So it's this idea of frayed edges, where you have a map where the edges are frayed, and where it just kind of goes off the edge. You don't know where the actual boundary is. Now, obviously, all games end up having a real boundary, a real practical boundary. It's like, well, this is what exists. But Dark Souls 1 has more of that wandering feel that I like, and it has more of that sense of like, where is this world's edges? What are the ends of the possibilities? Dark Souls 2 has this as well. Dark Souls 3 feels like it's a way more refined design, in a way that sort of loses some of that feeling for me, where Orbeck is your magic teacher, and you bring him scrolls in order to expand his inventory of magic to sell. Irina is your miracles teacher, and you find Braille tomes to expand her number of spells. Like, you're not finding NPCs out in the world. You're just like finding another item to bring to an NPC, and it kind of shrinks the world, right? Like, the fact that we have Laurentius and Quelana to teach you pyromancies in Dark Souls 1, or where you have Griggs and Logan and their sort of interaction, but then you also Dusk has this entire other branch of sorceries that opens up and expands the world in an interesting way. And I'm not saying that the Dark Souls 3 stuff like doesn't do that, but there's a certain like edge of refinement where it feels like everything's been too streamlined for Dark Souls 3, like made too uniform, where I feel like I don't quite get the sense of like anything can happen in a way. It's hard to describe precisely the feeling that I'm talking about, but there's a certain wildness to Dark Souls 1 and 2, especially in 1 with some of the way it's designed, that I just don't get with 3. And part of it is it feels like 3 is way more linear. It's a way more linear world to explore. I don't feel like I have as many options of like doing random stuff. It feels way more restrictive in some regards as well, in terms of like the leveling and things. Payoffs feel like they've been really tamped down on, where stuff is a lot flatter, like the balance is a lot flatter, and it just doesn't give me like the wild possibility of finding something really powerful. Dark Souls 2 started off feeling like I had the wild possibility of finding something powerful, but balance patches over time kind of roughed those edges down, where you had cool things like Santier's Spear doing a lot of unique stuff that they patched out because of PvP. Like, PvP is not great for RPGs in some regards. Like, you have to design... Slight aside, PvP... In a PvP world, you cannot assume scarcity or lack of knowledge. If something is good to have in large quantities, you're basically saying, like, if you are more successful having this like unique hidden thing, or having this secret, or having a huge stack of this thing, players will get that in one way or another, because it provides them an advantage in PvP. And so players are going to go for that advantage. You cannot have something like Santier's Spear and say, oh, this is a really powerful weapon that will never break once you've broken it and like uncovered its secret, but it's like this hidden thing that seems really garbage at first, and you have to go through a lot of rigmarole to make it work. That's a really freaking cool secret for a single player game. But for that's not like, you can make that item be overpowered in a single player game, because the number of players, like, theoretically, notwithstanding internet revealing all, that's a cool secret for the players who discover it. And for a lot of people, they're going to be like, well, this is garbage, and just chuck it in the box and ignore it, right? So you can do things where it's like, oh, this is really powerful if you find it, or if you understand how it works, or if you're going for that specific way. But in a PvP environment, that's not how balance works. Because in a PvP environment, you have to assume players know all of the like hidden things, have access to all of the hidden things, and can make use of it. And so it's a very different environment, and it works a very different way. And that influences how you're kind of designing things. So the PvP in Dark Souls can work really well, but it has a whole lot of potential ramifications on the rest of the design. So yeah, over time, I feel like the series, the Dark Souls trilogy, has gotten like more design refinement, like more refined in the design, but has lost some of the spark in the process. And even though some of that refinement I really like, particularly with the build mechanics, particularly with not having upgrades for armor and things like that, that they've expanded a lot of stuff, added a lot of new possibilities with cool spells that maybe feel underwhelming. Looking at you, I'm forgetting the name. It's the one that makes me think of Judgment from Tales of Symphonia. It's that ray of light one that you get up in the. Yeah, we're looking it up. What we're doing now. It's Miracle. I really like it. It's utter garbage. Divine Pillars of Light. I love it. It's really cool. It's terrible. But I like the boss weapon variety, and I like how many unique movesets there are, and I like the weapon arts stuff. I feel like Magic not using FP was probably better for Magic. But yeah, a lot of the world design just feels too streamlined. And the biggest thing is I feel Dark Souls 3's replayability is harmed by those, at least for me, to an extent. So I feel like those are a lot of my thoughts. There's a lot of stuff that's changed over the series. I think it's really interesting to see that, from how they're handling consequences for death to healing items and how they're handling that, and so on and so forth. So hopefully you have enjoyed this. Be curious to know what people think. And thank you all very much for watching. And until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.